It weighed 46,000 tons, yet floated on water. At over 882 feet long and 175 feet high, the Titanic was an unforgettable sight. The company that built it wanted the largest ship with state-of-the-art technology and every luxury imaginable. It was not disappointed. As the Titanic left England April 10, 1912 on a journey that would span the Atlantic, many watched as the looming figure of the seemingly perfect ship vanished into the distance. None expected it to sink just 4 days later. Today we find out the fate of those on board in this episode of the Infographics Show. Where did all the bodies on the Titanic disappear? The Titanic was the brainchild of the White Star Line, a shipbuilding company in direct competition with the other companies of the time. One of these, Cunard, had built the Lusitania and Mauretania in 1907, nautical masterpieces that crossed the Atlantic at record-breaking speeds and thereby earned their builders widespread acclaim and recognition. Not to be upstaged, White Star set about to make not one but 3 passenger ships to surpass all others in both size and luxury: the Titanic, the Olympic, and the Britannic. To their credit, builders Harland and Wolff succeeded in creating what were the world's largest man-made objects that moved. However, this feat came at a cost. The quantity of materials needed for these vessels was immense. As steel and rivet supplies dwindled, they were forced to use inferior versions, held together with lower-grade plates and rivets. Many believe the Titanic was doomed from the beginning. Indeed, evidence suggests that instead of bending as high-quality steel would do, pieces of the hull shattered and rivets broke as the vessel made impact with an iceberg off the Newfoundland coast. Less than 3 hours later, it was at the bottom of the sea. Ironically, the Titanic had been dubbed unsinkable due to its believed infallible design. It not only had electronic controls and a wireless communication system, but was equipped with sealable compartments to keep it afloat. However, as the ship veered left in a failed attempt to avoid the iceberg, nearly 300 feet of holes were knocked into its right-hand side. Water flowed into 6 of the supposed watertight compartments and then moved on to fill the rest. Many believed this event was mostly due to human error. A radioed warning of icy conditions, for example, was dismissed as unimportant. The lookouts responsible for sighting obstacles could not access their binoculars. Even the captain may have pressed on in hopes of making record speeds. Mother Nature was of no help either. Large chunks of ice and hazy optical illusions only contributed to the crash. Further, nearby ships could not tell the Titanic was sinking. The lack of aid, in addition to the shortage of lifeboats, resulted in a profound loss of life. In the panic and chaos, the boats that were available were also misused, leaving 400 empty seats and over 1,500 people stranded. As the front of the ship sank with the weight of incoming water, the back rose steadily higher. Mounting pressure eventually caused it to crack, sending the front into the depths of the ocean. The rest soon followed. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, what was left of the Titanic was gone. The 710 who survived were rescued by the Carpathia, responding to Titanic's signals of distress. It did not reach the area, however, until almost 2 hours later. While the Titanic sank in the darkness, the sun was rising by this time, highlighting the remains of the less fortunate, lifelessly suspended in the sea. The Carpathia was forced to navigate around multiple icebergs and past floating bodies to reach those still alive. Despite its best efforts, some of those rescued later died and were buried at sea. In all, over 1,500 passengers were lost. Compounding the tragedy further was the fact that of those who perished, only 340 were found. Some believe that these low numbers were in part due to weather. There's evidence that after the Titanic sank, a huge storm swept through the area, scattering those adrift over as many as 50 miles. In this case, by the time ships came for the bodies, recovery of many was impossible. Those who still floated beside what was left of the Titanic's doors, pillows, and chairs continued to be discovered throughout April and May. Ships such as the Mackay Bennett spent days pulling out those strapped to life jackets, identifying them and tagging their bodies for return to families or for burial. Sadly, even after many were gone, some operations were unprepared for the corpses that remained. There are reports that as vessels ran out of space, bodies of third-class passengers were tossed overboard in favor of those from first. In all, while a few hundred were lifted from their watery graves, upwards of 1,000 were unaccounted for, never again to be seen. What is left of those who were scattered all over the ocean's surface remains unknown. However, it's believed that a majority of those missing went down with the ship. Indeed, the underwater scene of the wreck, discovered miles below the surface of the Atlantic, holds countless indicators of death on a massive scale. A haunting photo from the surrounding seabed reveals boots and a jacket in positions to indicate that they once covered a body. This suggests the presence of what would have been a corpse, though no bones can be seen. Experts explain that what was a body and then a skeleton may have long ago turned to sediment. Additional shoes littered the ocean floor, a ghostly reminder of tragedy long ago. Some who have ventured inside of what's left of the Titanic have even seen clothing in there as well. A few explorers in the area claim to have found both a ring and a finger, but they reburied these without a trace. No other such discovery has been documented. The evidence that corpses once surrounded the Titanic and rested within its outermost structure is strong. However, what is deep within the wreck is up for debate. Some believe that hundreds died inside and remain there still. If this is true, it's possible that bones and teeth, perhaps even entire bodies, lie within it. After all, in the most interior areas closed off from currents and without a supply of oxygen-rich water, bodies would be free of fish or worms. In general, decomposition halts in such isolated conditions. In fact, organic materials left in similarly cold pressurized environments without access to a current have been preserved for as long as centuries. It would seem that inside the ship and nowhere else, that recognizable remains, should any exist, could be found. Fortunately, those at rest within the Titanic will be left in peace. As an over a century-year-old wreck, the Titanic now falls under the protection of the 2001 UNESCO Convention, making damage or pillage to the site illegal.
On April 15, 1912, at 2:20 in the morning, the British ocean liner Titanic disappeared into the depths of the North Atlantic Ocean about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. It took 3,000 men 2 years to build this massive ship. Its huge hull was held together by 3 million rivets, and it could transport 2,200 passengers and crew. But having struck an iceberg, the ship took on water before sinking 12,600 feet to the dark depths, never to be fully salvaged. Today, we ask why. In this episode of the Infographic Show, why is Titanic still at the bottom of the ocean? Before we answer this question, let's first look at what we know about Titanic's last few days at sea. On April 10th, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton, England on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was designed by the Irish shipbuilder Thomas Andrews, and it was owned by Bruce Ismay. It was thought to be unsinkable. The ship traveled to Cherbourg, France and Queenstown, Ireland to pick up some passengers before setting out into the Atlantic full steam ahead to New York. On its first journey across the highly competitive Atlantic ferry route, the ship carried some 2,200 passengers and crew. Just before midnight on April 14th, the Titanic collided with an iceberg which smashed into at least 5 of its hull compartments. As these compartments filled with water, the bow of the ship was pulled down until it was almost vertical. Then the Titanic broke in half before sinking to its end. More than 1,500 people died, either by being dragged down with the ship or freezing to death in the icy North Atlantic waters. It took nearly an hour and a half for help to arrive, but more than 700 people were saved. Most of those survivors were women and children. Milvina Dean was the last living survivor of the Titanic. She passed away on May 31st, 2009. Milvina was just 9 weeks old when the Titanic sank. So what do we know about the wrecked remains of this big vessel? Firstly, we've already mentioned that the ship sank to 12,600 feet. That's a long way down. In fact, it's over 2 miles at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It's pitch black and hard to access with extremely high water pressure. The ship also snapped into 2 pieces, which actually lay 1,970 feet apart from one another on the ocean floor. The New York Times ran an article about an expedition run by Dr. Robert D. Ballard to find the wreck. It took 11 dives to locate the debris, but the remains of Titanic were located on July 14, 1986, 74 years after it sank. On completing the mission, Ballard was quoted as saying, "I feel very confident the Titanic will never be raised. It would be impossible to pull it out of the bottom. Extensive rust has left the Titanic very fragile," he said. Its stern section, a shambles of wreckage, is about 2,000 feet astern of the bow half. Why the 2 parts are so widely separated remains a mystery. Following Ballard's discovery, there were a number of other trips, and between July and September 1987, an expedition mounted by I. Fremer and a consortium of American investors made 32 dives to Titanic using the submersible Naudil. Somewhat controversially, they recovered and brought ashore more than 1,800 objects. Then, in 1996, there was an ambitious attempt to raise a section of Titanic itself, a section of the outer hull that originally comprised part of the wall of 2 first-class cabins on C deck extending down to D deck. It weighed 20 tons, measured 15 by 25 feet, and had 4 portholes in it. British newspaper The Independent reported that the high-tech expedition to raise the Titanic used flotation bags filled with diesel fuel, which is lighter than water and could withstand the high pressure found at such depths. Over a 6-day period, the so-called lift bags were attached to the section of the hull with specially constructed cables. But when the bags were jettisoned to begin gently lifting the hull to the surface, only 4 of the 6 successfully launched. To salvage the mission, a submersible equipped with mechanical arms, which was owned by the French government, was brought in to save the day. Former astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin even joined the crew to add additional expertise. The crew succeeded, and the huge section of the ship was lifted more than 2 miles from the seabed by the flotation balloons. Onlookers paid as much as $6,000 to view the expedition from 2 ships nearby. So the Titanic has not been fully recovered, but then a big section has been, which in itself is quite an achievement. Is there still a chance to go back and recover more of the shipwreck? Maybe not. Earlier this year, the BBC reported that the hull might eventually disappear altogether, as scientists have said that a species of bacteria is slowly eating away its iron construction. However, if you have enough spare cash, there will soon be a once-in-a-lifetime tourist opportunity to glide around the Titanic's wreck. American company OceanGate is planning to dive to the wreck site in 2019. The first voyage is already fully booked at a hefty price tag of over $105,000 per person. And the Bluefish, a self-described experiential concierge firm, is also planning Titanic trips around the same time. So at least there's a chance to get a glimpse before she disappears forever.
8 a.m., April 2, 1912, the magisterial ship the Titanic leaves the Belfast dock for sea trials. Thousands of people have come to watch, waving their handkerchiefs in the air and shouting, "Rule Britannia." Some of them chase the ship down the slipway as she slowly moves away. Not one of them could ever expect that such a behemoth of a vessel would end up at the bottom of the icy cold ocean, dragging countless people to the depths with it. April 10, 1912. On a cold morning, Captain Edward John Smith arrives at the Southampton dock, where his crew has been sleeping on the Titanic through the night. Smith is a confident man and proud of British shipbuilding expertise. Prior to his heading the Titanic, he told the reporter, "Whatever happens, there will be time enough before the vessel sinks to save the life of every person on board." I will go a bit further. I will say I cannot imagine any condition that would cause the vessel to founder. Oh, how wrong could he be? We'll talk a lot about this guy as things go on. Later in the morning, 5th Officer Harold Lowe and 6th Officer James Moody are there to supervise a lifeboat drill. Unfortunately, the only one that would happen on the Titanic. As midday approaches, the passengers arrive, rich, poor, sometimes in between. The ship can take on 2,453 passengers, 833 in first class, 614 in second, 1,006 in third class, but there will only be about 2,200 passengers on board when the thing goes down. The wealthy board from one entrance and the poor at another entrance. Those with meager means are the third-class passengers who are on arrival checked for any eye disease called trachoma. The USA doesn't want those folks, but only one person it seems is turned away. Lucky him. About a third of third class dreaming of a new life in the US are not native English speakers. Their basic cabins reflect their status or class, as the British like to call it. These are the people who will suffer the worst, screaming in their native tongues as they slide down the deck of a ship, turning upward toward the sky. Some are Bulgarian, Syrian, Italian, Swedish, and Russian. Some are even Chinese, even though the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US means Chinese laborers aren't welcome in the country. The first-class passengers enter the beautiful cabins. They're bankers, businessmen, military leaders, socialites, athletes, American millionaires, and the ever-snooty British aristocracy. This is the who's who of wealthy society, and many have arrived with personal nurses, valets, chefs, and chauffeurs. On the ship, they'll enjoy Turkish baths, a gymnasium, a squash court, a saltwater swimming pool, and even the first-class kennels for their beloved pooches. For their trip and ultimately their death, some of them have paid around $90,000 in today's money. The second-class passengers, professionals, academics, religious men, and tourists, don't quite get such luxuries, but their cabins aren't too bad. It goes without saying that all three classes will not dine together. They're separated and will only really come together when they're faced with the matter of life and death. Today, these third-class folks will eat rabbit pie, potatoes, bread and butter, and some rhubarb and ginger jam for dessert. The first-class passengers will devour a 13-course meal, including foie gras, peaches and chartreuse jelly, and a helping of Waldorf pudding. It's early evening on April 10th when the ship leaves Cherbourg in France and heads to Queenstown, Ireland. Some of the working-class kids are playing on the baggage cranes while their parents play cards in the common room. Life isn't so bad at all in this ship, say some of the guys while smoking in the smoking room. No women allowed. As night falls, the upper classes are already lightheaded on champagne, talking of their business ventures and mansion renovations as semi-royal Brits whisper together about how vulgar in style and speech one fabulously wealthy American industrialist is, they can at least be assured that none of them will bump into another class, with grills all over the ship that separate the rich and poor. Midday, April 11th, and the ship finally arrives in Ireland. Many of the wealthy passengers have just woken up with sore heads, staring down at Norwegian salmon and poached eggs. The poor, for the most part, have been up since sunrise. About 2 p.m., more passengers board, and the Titanic is off again. It's about to get very cold. As the ship heads west over the Atlantic, the captain looks out into the distance. The weather is good. The passengers are all safely aboard. So far, he hasn't given much time to the fact that among his crew, only about 5% are able seamen. Most of the others have regular day jobs such as firemen, and little do they know anything about the perils of sailing. On April 12th, while merriment is being had by many on board, the morning is a wonderful thing to see. The skies are clear and the Atlantic is uncharacteristically calm. During the afternoon, 2 young working-class kids scream for joy as they play hide-and-seek, while America's first multimillionaire, the real estate tycoon and opium smuggler John Jacob Astor, talks with the Titanic's architect, Thomas Andrews. "Is it sinkable?" asks Astor with a smile on his face. This man is so rich, richer in relative terms than any person today, he probably thinks he's invincible. Andrews returns the smile, answering, "The ship even the great Poseidon couldn't sink." Both men laugh out loud as American silent film actress Dorothy Gibson walks over to see what's so amusing. Both of these men will soon be dead. Gibson will survive. Women and children first, that's how things will go. Although some men will try their luck, but for now all is perfect, and for 2 days, life aboard the Titanic couldn't be any better. As the evening of April 13th turns into night, the band plays under a blanket of stars and the conditions couldn't be any better. About 9:30 p.m., Captain Smith retires to his cabin, his job done for the day. He's not aware that the Titanic is about to sail under an Arctic high-pressure system. In the morning, things are not so fine and dandy. Around 9 a.m., senior wireless operator Jack Phillips is informed by other vessels that to the west there are icebergs. The liner, named the Carolina, tells them to watch out for the hard-to-see growlers, smaller icebergs that can still pose a danger to a large ship. At 10 a.m., Captain Smith tells his men they needn't bother with the lifeboat drill, even though he's been told about these floating fortresses of ice. What this means is his crew, a mostly amateur crew, does not know much about evacuations. We will never truly know why Smith does this. At midday, the steamship Baltic informs the Titanic that larger icebergs wait on its heading. Smith passes on the message to the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay. It is this man that's behind the building of the Titanic and other huge ocean liners. He's also the person that decided such ships needed much fewer lifeboats than was necessary in times of great danger. When the Titanic goes down, he will make a quick getaway into a lifeboat, even though many women and children will still be on board. He'll be one who sends a message back to the New York office. "Deeply regret to advise you Titanic sank this morning 15th after collision iceberg, resulting serious lost life, further particulars later." One day he'll open a newspaper and read a poem that contains the lines, "To hold your place in the ghastly face of death on the sea at night is a seaman's job, but to flee with the mob is an owner's noble right." He will survive, but a breakdown will ruin him, with opiates and booze turning him into what his family's calling a living corpse. But on that afternoon of the 14th, when he's told about the icebergs, he doesn't give it too much thought. As the hours pass, though the passengers rich and poor start putting on extra clothes, it is freezing out here. About this time, Smith orders his crew to take a different direction. In the late afternoon, the Titanic gets a message from the German ship SS America, which is a bit to the south of the Titanic. Radio operators on the America tell the radio operators on the Titanic that it's just passed 2 large icebergs. This is now getting serious, but Smith doesn't get this particular message. As the evening falls, the weather is now bitterly cold. The SS Californian tells the Titanic that it's just seen 3 large icebergs close to where the Titanic might be heading. Later, at about 9:30 p.m., the steamer Meseba tells the Titanic operators that it's just seen much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs, also field ice. Jack Phillips hears these warnings loud and clear, but he never relays them to Smith and the others in charge. This is a major mistake, a fatal mistake. But it has to be said that the day before, the radio equipment had been broken, and that meant Smith had a deluge of messages from passengers that he still needed to send. Some of the VIPs on the ship have serious business to attend to. At 10:30 p.m. that night, Phillips receives another message from Cyril Evans of SS Californian. He is informed that the Californian has had to halt for the night in a field of ice. "Say, old man, we're stopped and surrounded by ice," says Evans. "It's just too dangerous to go on." Smith replies to the message with the words, shut up, I'm working Cape Race." Newfoundland's Cape Race is the relay station for the radio messages. About this time, there are some changes to the Titanic's bridge. First Officer William Murdoch tells Second Officer Charles Lightoller that he will now take over the watch. Lightoller will become the man that makes sure, for the most part at least, that the order of women and children first is adhered to. He'll be the most senior officer to survive the disaster, and even become a hero of the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War II. Just before his shift is over, he tells the lookouts to keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers. Once Murdoch is on watch, his nerves become jangled. Danger's out there in the ocean, but it's a danger that seems cloaked in invisibility. As he looks into the distance at around 11 p.m., the majority of the passengers have retired to their cabins without an inkling of the precarious position their lives are in. Two lookouts named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are now in the Titanic's crow's nest. They struggle to see any icebergs, mainly because of the fact that the sea is so calm, which means the water isn't hitting the ice and making a splash. It doesn't help matters that they don't have any binoculars. The guy with the locker key where they're kept has them, and that's no use now. They're all alone as the Californian now turns off its radio. At 11:30, Lookout Fleet rings the bell. He's just seen an iceberg and the Titanic is heading right into it. Fleet asks the bridge, "Is there anyone there?" He then hears the reply, "Yes, what do you see?" To which he responds, "Iceberg, right ahead." Murdoch gives the order for the ship to hard a starboard and reverses the engines, as well as ordering that all the supposedly airtight doors to the compartments are locked. A few minutes later, at 11:40, the Titanic scrapes past the giant iceberg, making a frightening noise as it does so. This is one great chunk of ice. The Titanic has before been moving at a fairly fast speed of 22 knots, so despite the order to reverse the engines, it can't slow down fast enough to move out of the way of the iceberg. Captain Smith had promised a swift journey to his passengers, and he wasn't about to disappoint them. Such haste, we now know, was one reason for the disaster. That order to hard a starboard, which takes some doing, has caused technical problems that means the rudder isn't functioning right. If Murdoch had instead ordered the ship to maintain its speed and turn, not reverse the engines, it may have actually missed the iceberg. The ship had scraped along the ice for about 7 seconds, and in doing so, chunks of ice have even fallen onto the deck. Its engines have now stopped and it's facing north while drifting south. There is an eerie silence on board among some of the men and a feeling of great anxiety. They have every right to feel anxious because a large rip has been made in the hull. The hole below the water is about 12 square feet, although the tear stretches for around 300 feet. Why a hole has been torn through such a tough ship will be debated for many years to come. Ships just as strong will later get through whackings and survive. But that's the future, and we're not speculating today. Many of the passengers feel a thud as the ship makes contact with the iceberg. More so, those on the lower decks. The Titanic is taking on lots of water, something not evident to many just yet. 7 tons a second are flooding into the ship, which is much faster than it can be pumped out. By about 11:50, so much water has been entering the ship that the front part has risen. In a boiler room, all hell is breaking loose. Second Engineer J.H. Hesketh and leading stoker Frederick Barrett are both blasted by icy water and get out of the room just in time. They're now aware, as are the other engineers that know what's going on, that if the freezing cold water hits the hot steam, an explosion could blow them to pieces, although most of them are soon to die anyway. Some of them have been ordered to vent the steam so as to stop an explosion. All of them are now up to their waists in water. The main problem is what's happening on the 16 lower decks, not up top, where many people have not even batted an eyelash over the crash. The third-class passengers are down below, most of them on F deck, with some on E deck, along with second-class passengers. D deck contains a number of rooms, including the first-class dining saloon. Deck C is home to a library and a lounge for second-class folks, as well as an all-male smoking room for third-class passengers. It isn't until you get to Deck B that you have the first-class cabins and suites, as well as the a la carte restaurant, Café Parisien. Deck A is for the first-class promenade, and among other things, the all-male first-class smoking room. So it's the poorer passengers that really hear the thud, even though they're already accustomed to loud noises issuing from the engines. Even if they're scared and want to go up to a higher deck, they aren't able to since they're locked out of those places. It's now midnight and Captain Smith is aware that the compartments are filling with water. He's also aware that the Titanic is not designed to float with water-filled compartments, and right now, water is seeping into them at an alarming rate. Once one is filled, the next one starts to fill, with experts later saying the effect was like that of filling a tray of ice cubes. He orders the lifeboats to be prepared for an evacuation, but the fact is there are only enough of them for about half the crew and passengers. You already know why. Meanwhile, the radio operators are busy putting out CQD calls. The D stands for distress. The closest ship, it seems, is the Frankfurt. It's about 170 nautical miles away to the south of the Titanic. The Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, also gets the message, but it's way off in the distance. The Titanic is on its own for now. Still not long after midnight, Smith and the ship's builder Thomas Andrews, who we've mentioned already, go down below as the ship starts to list. There they find holds filled with water, as is the squash court. And while men are busy trying to pump the water out, they just can't get ahead. The first-class women and children are now on the deck waiting for lifeboats, with many of them in tears, clutching to one another. It's at this point when many of the passengers know this ship is in trouble, although they don't know about the lifeboat shortage, and many of them still don't think there's a major problem. Some are very reluctant to get into a lifeboat. The Titanic, they assume, is just not going to sink. The good news, at least for the operators and captains, is that at around 12:20 a.m. a ship not too far away gets the distress call and replies. That ship, the Carpathia, hears the words, "Come at once, we have struck a berg." It's a CQD, old man. The coordinates are given as 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 14 minutes west. The Carpathia changes course, but it's still around 58 nautical miles away. It will be a matter of hours until it can get close to the Titanic. Among the chaos that's now descended on the ship, the musicians are playing on the deck in an attempt to keep people calm. Before all of these men die, they play mostly popular ragtime tunes, and later might just have time to fit in a version of the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." If this actually happens is up for debate, but it makes for a nice story. It's about 12:30 when 5 compartments are totally filled with water, about 13,700 tons of the stuff, which means the Titanic will not stay afloat much longer. Maybe it's got 2 hours before it's completely submerged. For now, it's only at about a 4-degree angle, and for the while at least, it won't get much worse. And this gives the crew and passengers a false sense of security. Maybe she won't totally sink, some of them think. But they are very wrong. Pity, because some of them have refused to go onto the lifeboats, which is another reason why most of the boats left with way too few people on them. It's around this time that some of the crew have another reason to be hopeful. They see a ship in the distance, so fire off a bunch of rockets. That ship is very likely a Norwegian fishing vessel doing a spot of illegal hunting. The Californian does actually see those rockets, but it's still some 20 nautical miles away. It's 12:45 and Smith is now loading the first lifeboats. The regular ones can take 65 people on board. Even though the ship already doesn't have enough boats, Smith keeps letting them go well under capacity. The first floats away with only 27 people in it. Arguably, he is to blame for many of the deaths. Yet, for many years he will be a hero. He never gives an abandoned ship order, and he doesn't even do a proper evacuation, not to mention the fact that he wasn't taking those iceberg warnings seriously enough. He even gets the deck wrong when he first orders people to get onto the lifeboats. As the gravity of what's going to happen hits him, Smith becomes almost paralyzed with shock and fear. He isn't in control at all, and he hasn't told the crew the truth about the lifeboat situation. At 12:55, the second lifeboat hits the water, and as it does, 2 cowardly men jump down onto it, injuring some of the women. The next one to go has on the passenger Molly Brown, a rich American socialite. She'll also become famous in the time to come, mainly because she wanted to go back and pick up people in the water. Robert Hitchens, who was steering the Titanic when it hit the iceberg, will also be in that lifeboat, and he will tell Brown that there's no point in going back for stiff bodies. And anyway, it's too risky as those left alive might swamp the boat. He'll deny this later, but will admit that he was concerned that the suction of the sinking of the Titanic might pull the lifeboat down. By all accounts, Brown threatened to throw him in the water, but they never went back to find survivors. At 1 a.m., a smaller lifeboat, a wooden cutter, hits the water, filled with some wealthy women and children. Controversially, the rich Scottish landowner, the 5th Baronet Cosmo Duff Gordon, is also in the boat along with his wife, Lady Duff Gordon, a famous fashion designer. Other rich men are in the boat, as is a lookout who's been put in charge named George Thomas MacDonald Simons. 5 other crew are also on the boat. It can hold 40 people but takes 12. Later, it'll be suggested that Cosmo Duff Gordon paid a bribe to get away and not pick up any struggling people in the water. But whether that happened is also debatable. As the boat floats away, one of the crew says he wants to go back and help others, but the women protest. Once they're in the distance, Lady Duff Gordon surprises one of the crew when she looks at another wealthy woman and states, "There is your beautiful nightdress gone." This is going to cause quite the stink within the British public once it gets out. On the Titanic, there's a major concern when some of the crew see that on Deck E, the grand staircase is now covered in water. It's just past 1 a.m. At around the same time, another waste of life occurs when a lifeboat is lowered with just 28 people on it. One of them is the first-class passenger Lucy Noel Martha, Countess of Roths, as well as Ida Strauss, the wife of Macy's department store owner Isidore. She lets go of his hand and gets in the boat, motioning to him to go with him. He likely can if he tries, but he tells her, "Women and children first, darling." She looks at him and replies, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." She gets right back out. The two of them will go down together on the ship in each other's arms. The last sighting of them is hugging on the deck. You might be wondering where all the third-class passengers are. It's true that there are grills that prevent them from getting to other parts of the ship, but they aren't locked within the sinking ship out of sheer brutality. They are in fact behind bars, but that's only because they've been that way from the start of the journey due to U.S. immigration laws regarding immigrants and certain infectious diseases. It's still brutal, cruel, inhumane, and more so when you hear that there are no lifeboats on the third-class section of the ship. Many of these passengers are now running through the maze of corridors trying to find a safer place, and fortunately the staircases lead some of them to the third and second-class promenade where there are lifeboats. Nonetheless, some of them are faced with iron grills and locks, at least until the orders are given to open the gates. One of them is Carl Jansen. He goes back to his room to gather what belongings he has, only to be hit by the great force of water. He at least gets his watch, but returns to the deck to people stricken with terror. He survives, but many of those people don't. Some of them are undoubtedly unwilling to leave all their worldly possessions behind. Remember, they're going to the US to start a new life, but many of them have also been trapped by those gates, and they will die because of it. What's quite touching is when the orders are first given to let women and children go first, most of the third-class men don't try to jump onto the boats. In fact, reports later stated they stood back and said goodbye to their families, and they took it on the chin. A few didn't, but we'll get to them. At 1:20 a.m., these men are quite aware that they're possibly going to die. It's at that time that another lifeboat is lowered, this one containing a special passenger. That's a 9-year-old girl named Milavina Dean, who will die in 2009 at the age of 97, the last of the survivors to go. There's a mix of people on this lifeboat, and with 56 passengers on board, it's at least one that leaves carrying a substantial number of people. Another one of them is the mistress of the super wealthy American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim. He waves her goodbye and tells his valet to get dressed in smart clothes. Some of his last words are, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." At 1:30, not all the men are so cool-headed. Several of them try to hustle their way onto Lifeboat 14, which forces 5th Officer Harold Lowe to fire his gun a few times into the air and shout, "Get back or I'll shoot you all like dogs." Just after 1:30, Lifeboat 13 is lowered, this one containing a number of third-class passengers. Only as it goes down, Lifeboat 15 is lowered too fast and it drops on 13, causing some amount of distress. Thankfully, a crew member on 13 manages to cut the ropes and the boat floats away. It's around this time that Phillips gets on the radio again and says, "Women and children in boats cannot last much longer." At 1:40, there aren't many lifeboats left to go. Number 16 drifts away into the darkness, followed by collapsible boat C, containing Miss Ismay and mostly women. Lifeboat 11 then leaves. The emergency cutter number 2 is ready to go, but Lightoller is dismayed to find it filled with men who says are not British nor of the English-speaking race, and he threatens them with his gun. Women and children take their place, but it's lowered with just 25 people on it when it can take 40. You might remember the multi-millionaire John Astor. He watches his pregnant wife Madeline get into lifeboat number 4. She pleads with him to follow her, but Lightoller tells her he won't be going anywhere. Astor says, "We are safer here than in that little boat." It leaves with enough space for 20 people. It's 2 in the morning now, and the only way off the Titanic is on one of the 3 collapsible boats that are left. Things don't look so good. The ship has tilted so much now that its propeller is out of the water. The lights go out, and they're swallowed by the darkness. In the distance, the survivors in the lifeboats begin to cry for those they left behind. Now they can hear screams emanating from the ship, betwixt the groaning of the floundering ship. Second-class passenger Father Thomas Biles has been on the stern of the Titanic listening to people's final confessions. The band is still playing, but there's trouble in the radio room when a man tries to steal a life vest. Officer Lightoller now knows it's do or die, so gets on the roof of the officer's quarters and dives into the freezing water. Maybe Lady Luck has ideas for him, because after being sucked into a ventilation shaft, he's pushed back out by hot air. Back on the Titanic, the forward funnel has collapsed. It crushes many people, including the founder of the Internationalization Tennis Federation, Charles Duane Williams. The next collapsible can't even be launched, being swept off the deck at 2:12 a.m. and taking a few people with it. When it lands upside down in the water, about 30 men cling to it, including wireless operator Bride and Officer Lightoller, who's had another bit of luck. They eventually get picked up by lifeboats 4 and 12, but hundreds are now freezing in the water. Collapsible Boat A just about makes it off the deck at 2:15, but is soon swamped with people. First-class passenger Edith Evans is one of them, but she, like the others, ends up in the water and dies. To think she's just given up her place on another boat. The only female who goes down with the Titanic and survives is Rhoda Abbott. Even though she refuses to leave her 2 teenage sons behind, they both die. On the deck, Captain Smith tells those that are left, "It's every man for himself. He's seen one last time on the bridge after that. He either goes down with the ship or jumps overboard just before it goes down. There are differing accounts. The last anyone sees of Thomas Andrews is him sitting quietly in the first-class smoking room. He makes no attempt at all to escape, although some accounts have him throwing deck chairs into the ocean for passengers that have gone overboard. Either way, he dies. He might even jump overboard with Smith. That's how hectic things are. People are seeing different things. It's almost the end now. As the ship tilts steeply, people try to cling to one another, but a large gush of water pulls them overboard. Others are washed down the deck, their bodies mangled against various parts of the ship. At 2:18, the ship breaks in two. The bow sinks into the ocean, and at a speed of 30 miles per hour, it takes about 6 minutes to reach the bottom. The stern levels for a while, but then violently rises, throwing people all over the place. Those few that manage to cling to something are doing so in vain because the entire ship is about to plunge into the abyss. It's 2:20 when some of the people in the lifeboats hear the Titanic finally being swallowed by the water. There's one last groan, and that's it. But even worse because the ship goes down with so much force that it takes tables, chairs, and huge chunks of timber and steel down with it. A lot of the debris comes right back up, and does so with some speed, killing the swimmers on impact. It's likely they'll die anyway, with -2 degrees Celsius water being enough to finish most people off in a few minutes. That's if the shock of being submerged hasn't already killed them. Many swimmers die between 15 and 30 minutes in the water, their bodies going into cardiac arrest. Only 13 of them are fished out by lifeboats. Even though if all the boats go back, 500 people can be helped. It's anyone's guess how many folks could have been saved, but that some people needlessly died is true. As they float through the water in the darkness, the survivors hear shouts of anger, cries of distress, screams of pain, sounds they'll never forget. One of the survivors will later sum up what he hears, saying, "It was a dismal moaning sound which I won't ever forget. It came from those poor people who were floating around, calling for help. It was horrifying, mysterious, supernatural." At times, the lifeboats float past a person. Its occupants apologize for not helping the swimmer, but rather than become upset, the swimmer just says, "I understand, and good luck and God bless you." But as they float on, they hear one man, perhaps the last man, shout, "My God, my God." As he freezes, his voice loses hope until all that's left is silence. That's all there is after a while, stiff bodies and silence. But one guy who does survive for a long time in the water is the Titanic's chief baker, Charles Jolin. Prior to the sinking of the Titanic, he drinks more whiskey than is humanly possible, having just turned down the offer to get in Lifeboat 10. Right before he heads for his drink, he persuades reluctant women to get into the boats. When he emerges on the deck, most people have gone, so he throws a bunch of chairs into the ocean to use as flotation devices. But then he changes his mind. He grabs hold of something and, in his own words, goes down with the ship as if it's an elevator. He miraculously treads water for about 2 hours. Maybe because of that booze he just drank. He doesn't even feel cold. When there's some daylight, he spots a boat. It's Lightollers' boat, but Lightoller denies him a place. Jolin holds onto the boat anyway, and then when he sees another boat, he swims over and gets on that one. How he survives is anyone's guess, but later, when asked, he'll put it down to the whiskey. Whatever the case, he'll be known as the last surviving person on the Titanic. He was a tough old boot, that's for sure. Nonetheless, don't go thinking booze will stop you from getting hypothermia. It actually makes things worse. So we can't explain how Jolin survived so long, while others died in a matter of minutes. He didn't panic, which counts for something. The first sound heard by the survivors is that of the approaching Carpathia at around 3:30 a.m. By 4, people are being pulled from boats, most of them alive, but more than a few already dead. Those with the strength climb onto the ship while others are hoisted up with ropes. More than 1,500 have died, 706 live to tell the tale. At 8:30 a.m., the Californian scouts the area looking for survivors, but of course there are none. The others are taken to New York City, where they'll arrive on April 18th to huge crowds and hordes of journalists. Some of the surviving crew are interviewed, but what really happened on that ship is something they're too traumatized to talk about. Many questions are later asked. One, of course, is why so few lifeboats? But even with the mass grief and global outrage, no one is ever really held accountable. An act of God is blamed, but we now know that human error was more to the point. Perhaps one of the best artifacts from the wreckage is a watch that was pulled out of the water. That's because it stopped when its owner drowned, 2:28 a.m. In 1985, the wreckage was found 12,500 feet underwater, around 370 nautical miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The two parts are still now separated by about 2,000 feet. It's the rich and famous names who we remember, so we guess the classes on that boat were separated even in death. But we remember you third-class victims. Miss Joanna Persdotter Aylen, Mr. Carl Iver Sven Berglund, Mr. Ludavid Kaur, Miss Kate Connolly, Mr. Li Bing and Mr. Fang Lang, Mr. Hussein Mahmoud Hussein Ibrahim, Okay, we can't go through all the poor folks that died, and to be honest, about 100 of them were buried in unmarked graves. But you get the picture. Many of them were immediately forgotten, while the media and public mourned for just a few known names. At least the fish understood those dead people were all the same in the bigger scheme of things. The most iconic ship of all time, the RMS Titanic is also the most tragic vessel ever launched. Lauded as unsinkable by her designer and captain, it took just one disastrous encounter with a stray iceberg to prove the folly of man. You are probably familiar with the story of the Titanic, but how much do you really know about this iconic vessel and its disastrous voyage? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at 50 incredible facts about the Titanic. 50. The RMS Titanic was the largest movable man-made object of her day, 882 feet and 9 inches long, 92 feet wide, and 175 feet high. She could move at 23 knots, making her fast for her size. 49. The Titanic had 840 cabins for passengers, 416 in first class, 162 in second class, and 262 in third class. She could carry up to 900 tons worth of freight and baggage. 48. She was powered by 29 triple-furnace coal-fired boilers, burning 825 tons of coal per day, with a storage capacity of 6,611 tons of coal, just enough for a round trip across the Atlantic. 47. The Titanic was hardly an environmentally friendly ship, however, dumping 100 tons of ash into the sea each day. 46. The Titanic had 4 giant funnels reaching up 81.5 feet above the deck, the purpose of which were to ensure the passengers weren't covered in the soot that she ejected. 45. The 4th funnel was only added for aesthetic reasons to make the ship look powerful and majestic, and used for ventilation. 44. The Titanic had 10 decks total, and strung along these decks were 10,000 light bulbs. 43. 2 engines powered the 3 propellers. 2 were at her rear and weighed 38 tons combined, and 1 was at her center and weighed 22 tons. 42. The Titanic was originally the SS Titanic, SS meaning screw steamer, as in driven by propellers or screws, and also standing for steamship. She only became the RMS Titanic after carrying British Royal Mail, thus becoming Royal Mail Steamer Titanic. 41. 2 anchors, each weighing 15 tons, were used to hold the mighty ship in place when she docked. 20 horses were used to transport a single anchor during her construction. 40. In 1955, Walter Lord published A Night to Remember, a non-fiction account of the Titanic tragedy, which was soon released as a movie in 1958. The story regenerated public interest in the tragedy after waning substantially over the years, and is likely the only reason we still talk about her today. 39. The Titanic took 2 years to construct and cost an equivalent of $166 million in today's money. That's $34 million less than the cost of the 1997 movie Titanic, which was $200 million. 38. A 228-foot tall gantry was built over the Titanic to construct her, the largest ever built at the time, from which up to 15,000 men would work during her construction. 37. 3 million rivets were used to join together the pieces of her hull. However, unlike many other ships built at the time, in order to cut costs, the Titanic's rivets were a mix of iron and steel. Even weaker iron rivets were used on the bow of the ship, which would be the section that later struck the iceberg. 36. 8 construction workers were killed during the construction of the Titanic, and 246 were injured. An unwritten expectation from back in her time was 1 death per 1 million pounds spent, which put her death total of 8 well under budget and was considered a great success. 35. The Titanic carried 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 40,000 eggs, 6,000 pounds of butter, 15,000 bottles of beer, 1,000 bottles of wine, 850 bottles of liquor, and 8,000 cigars. 34. Her crew and passengers drank 14,000 gallons of water a day. 33. For her last dinner on the night of April 14, 1912, passengers in first class enjoyed oysters, salmon, filet mignon, sauté of chicken lyonnaise, lamb and mint sauce, roast duckling, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, and French ice cream. Passengers in third class had the option of gruel, cabin biscuits, and cheese. Luckily for both first and third class, fresh fish would be pretty immediately available completely for free just a few hours later. 32. The Titanic was capable of carrying 64 lifeboats, well over her maximum capacity of 3,547 people, yet only planned to carry 48. That number was eventually reduced to just 20 for cosmetic reasons, as it made the decks look less cluttered. 31. Despite being far too few for the total number of passengers, the Titanic's 20 lifeboats was technically legal, as law at the time was based on the gross registered tonnage of a ship, not her passenger capacity. 30. The Titanic carried 2 wooden cutters with a capacity of 40 people each, 14 30-foot wooden lifeboats with a capacity of 65 each, and 4 collapsible lifeboats with a capacity of 47 each. This meant that only 33% of Titanic's passengers and crews could fit on the lifeboats. 29. Because it took 2.5 hours for the Titanic to sink, had there been enough lifeboats, every single person aboard could have been saved. 28. Of the 20 lifeboats aboard, only 18 were successfully launched. 2 collapsible lifeboats simply floated away. 27. Only 9 people were rescued from the water after the lifeboats launched, 3 of which died shortly after to hypothermia. 26. 30 people managed to survive by sitting, standing, or kneeling atop the upturned hull of a collapsible lifeboat B after they failed to right it. 25. The Titanic had 3,500 life jackets aboard, but the water was so cold that they would have been useless, as people simply froze to death within minutes of entering the frigid water. 24. Despite having a capacity of 65, the first lifeboat launched with just 28 people. This was due to people being reluctant to leave the ship, as they did not consider themselves to be in imminent danger. 23. A total of 472 seats aboard the lifeboats went unused. 22. Another lifeboat with a capacity of 65 carried only 12 people, 5 first-class passengers and 7 crew members. The press nicknamed it the Millionaire's Boat, who accused the occupants of ignoring the cries for help from people in the water. Some things never change. 21. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, a member of the Millionaire's Boat, paid each of the 7 crew members in his lifeboat £5 each, the equivalent of $510 in today's dollars. He was later heavily criticized for paying the men, but claimed that he was simply compensating them for the loss of their kit. We're sure it had absolutely nothing to do with launching the boat early and keeping it away from drowning victims desperately calling for help. 20. Jack B. Thayer, a survivor, said of the Millionaire's Boat, "The partly filled lifeboat standing about 100 yards away never came back. Why on earth they never came back is a mystery. How could any human being fail to heed those cries? We think it's because money clearly doesn't buy you humanity." 19. One lifeboat returned to try and save others after launching, despite fears of being overwhelmed by desperate victims or being dragged under downward by suction that caused the Titanic sinking. We're guessing there were probably no rich people aboard that particular boat. 18. Lifeboats floated for 1 hour and 10 minutes in open water before the rescue ship Carpathia arrived on the scene. Luckily, the seas were relatively gentle. Had they been rough, it's likely all would have perished. 17. The Carpathia secured 13 of the Titanic's lifeboats, but left 7 to float adrift. Days later, the Canadian ship Mackay Bennett tried to bring 1 boat on board but failed. There's a chance at least one of the Titanic's lifeboats could still be bobbing around somewhere in the Atlantic. 16. Souvenir hunters removed the plates from the lifeboats containing the name Titanic, as well as the lifeboat numbers. Able seaman Tom Jones pried off number 8 from lifeboat 8 and sent it to Lucy Noel Martha, the Countess of Roths. 15. It's thought the rest of the surviving lifeboats were put to use by the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. 14. 6 life jackets from the Titanic remain in existence in museums or private collections around the world. 13. On the 25th of June 2008, one blood-stained life jacket was sold at auction in New York for £34,692. 12. Prior to the Titanic's sinking, American author Morgan Robertson wrote the novel Futility, in which an ocean liner named Titan strikes an iceberg on her maiden voyage. 11. Before her collision, the Titanic received 6 ice warnings from passing ships. 10. Despite fog and unsafe waters, the Titanic steamed along at 22.5 knots, or just half a knot below her top speed of 23 knots. From the moment lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg dead ahead, it took only 30 seconds for the ship to crash into it. 9. 4 forward compartments could have flooded without the Titanic sinking, but 6 were ruptured in the collision. The iron rivets used in her construction have been universally blamed for her sinking. 8. The iceberg caused a 220 to 245 foot long gash under her waterline, causing an opening 12 cubic feet along a fourth of the ship. 7. Flooding at a rate of 400 tons per minute, it took the Titanic 160 minutes to sink. 6. Approximately 38,000 tons of water filled the bow of the Titanic, causing the ship's stern to lift up out of the water and split the ship in half just in front of the third funnel. 5. It took the 2 sections of the Titanic between 5 and 10 minutes to reach the sea bottom. 4. The water temperature at the time was 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing. The Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, described hitting the water as 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. 3. A photograph taken by the liner Prince Adelbert just a few miles south of the Titanic's sinking may be of the iceberg responsible for her sinking. 2. The Titanic iceberg was thought to originally have been 1 mile long when first born off the coast of Greenland, but it was estimated to be between 200 and 400 feet at the time of the sinking. 1. Approximately 300 icebergs reached the North Atlantic shipping lanes in April 1912, the highest number for 50 years. The Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, was quoted as saying, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause the ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." While in command of the Adriatic, had the Titanic not cut corners by using weaker rivets, it's well possible that the good captain may have been proven right. April 14, 1912. In the 40th minute of the 23rd hour, somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean, the RMS Titanic is unwelcomely kissed on the cheek by a rather stubborn iceberg. You know what happens next. But you might not know that one of the passengers, the ship's chief baker, defied death that night. This heroic man refused to get on one of the lifeboats, instead making sure women and children were saved. When the ship finally plunged into the water, he wrote it down in his own words as if it was an elevator. But what we liked about this man is the fact that when he knew the end was nigh, he decided to get hammered. He went into the pantry and chugged down some liquor. Why not end on a high, he must have thought. He very likely was the last person alive on that ship just before it was completely submerged. The last who survived, that is. So his story is important. But what's more, he spent 2 hours in that freezing cold water in his drunken state. While others died in minutes, he tread water and didn't even feel very cold. It's nothing short of a miracle that this happened. You'll hear more about him later and the reasons he survived when he really should have died. But since he was the last guy on the ship, we'll leave his story to last. When you read about the number of people that were on the ship that fateful night, not all the sources sound the same. We can't be sure what exactly the numbers were, but you'll generally hear about 2,200, 900 of whom were working on the ship. Some of the passengers were insanely wealthy, others were depressingly poor. First-class tickets on the Titanic went up to £870. Third-class tickets cost as little as £7. If we were thinking in US dollars, we're talking over $130,000 in today's money for the best first-class ticket and over $1,000 in today's money for a third-class ticket. A second class would have set you back about $1,834 in today's money. So the experience on that ship was very different for many people. Some of the deaths became front-page news. If there were social media platforms back then, these deaths would have resulted in a lot of strangers writing RIP on their Facebook pages. But some of the poorest people on the Titanic didn't even get a marked gravestone. Some survivors never really recovered from the ordeal. One of them was Frederick Fleet. He was one of the crewmen on the ship and the one that shouted iceberg when things were looking a bit hairy. He later testified in court saying things might have been different if he had some binoculars. In his own words, he said, "We could have all seen it a bit sooner." When someone asked him just how much sooner, he replied, "Well, enough to get out of the way." When he saw the iceberg from the nest at 11:39 p.m., he rang the bell to notify the others. He also used the nest phone to tell the bridge that there was possible trouble ahead. The call was answered by 6th Officer James Paul Moody, who asked Fleet exactly what he'd seen. Fleet replied, "Iceberg, right ahead." During his testimony, he was asked how large the iceberg was, and he said he didn't really know. But then, when asked if it was about as large as one of the tables in the courtroom, he replied, "It would be as large as those 2 tables put together when I saw it first." Fleet was ordered to help put people on lifeboats. He got in Lifeboat 6 himself, along with 28 other people, 4 of whom were other men. Lifeboat 6 could have held 65 people. Fleet was one of the men that managed the oars on that lifeboat. The guy on the tiller of the boat was Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, a man whose name went down in history. That's because of the way he allegedly treated other occupants of the boat. Some of them later said he refused to pick up people in the water, calling some of the people stiffs. Then there's the famous story of the millionaire named Molly Brown, who got so peeved with him that she threatened to throw him in the water. She became angry when Hitchens told her that if they went back, they would likely be swamped and go down themselves. She wrote about her experience in the Newport Herald newspaper, saying, "The only seaman in our boat was the quartermaster. He was put at the rudder and standing much higher than we were. He was shivering like an aspen. As we pulled away from the boat, we heard sounds of firing and were told later it was officers shooting as they were letting down the boats from the steamer, trying to prevent those from the lower decks from jumping onto the lifeboats." She was wrong about him being the only able seaman. As you know, Fleet was also an able seaman. Fleet, by the way, became very depressed after the accident, and his life later ended bleakly. As for Molly Brown, it said another reason why she threatened Hitchens is that she told him that the women on the boat should row to keep warm. Hitchens didn't like this idea at all. Rowing was a man's job. It's hard to know exactly what happened that night. As the Aspen Democrat-Times said in its April 19, 1912 edition, some of the stories sounded quite hysterical. Some stories were sensational. Brown wrote some more about her time on the lifeboat, and we think her words are quite moving. She said, "The splash of the oars partly drowned the voices of the perishing men on the doomed steamer. The ladies all seemed terrified. Those having husbands, sons, or fathers buried their heads on the shoulders of those near them and moaned and groaned only, while my eyes were glued on the fast-disappearing ship. I partially watched the broad promenade deck. Brown was one of the lucky ones. 39% of the first-class passengers died, mostly men. 76% of the third-class passengers died, and 58% of the second-class passengers died. It wouldn't be fair not to let Hitchens have his say too. We found his testimony. In it, he explained why he wanted to get as far away as possible from the sinking Titanic. He said, "Everybody seemed in a very bad condition in the boat, sir. Everybody was quite upset, and I told them that somebody would have to pull. There was no use stopping there alongside the ship, and the ship gradually going by the head. We were in a dangerous place." He also said that he told everyone to row, women too. As for some of the misunderstandings, he said, "The wind had sprung up a bit then, and it got very choppy. I relieved one of the young ladies with the oar and told her to take the tiller. She immediately let the boat come athwart, and the ladies in the boat got very nervous, so I took the tiller back again and told them to manage the best they could." He talked about arguing with a woman, saying, "She was rather vexed with me in the boat, and I spoke rather straight to her, and she accused me of wrapping myself up in blankets in the boat, using bad language, and drinking all the whiskey, which I deny, sir." He said no one on the boat told him to go back toward the sinking Titanic once they were away, but he admitted that at first he told everyone they needed to get away because if not, the suction created by the sinking ship would pull them under the water. When a senator at the hearing asked him if he said the words, "We are to look out for ourselves now and pay no attention to those stiffs," Hitchens issued a denial. "I never made use of that word, never since I've been born, because I use other words in preference to that," he said. We may never know the truth about the drama on that boat or if there was much drama at all. As Brown said, there was an eerie atmosphere when the Titanic's lights went out. In his testimony, Hitchens said, "We did hear the cries of distress, or I imagine so, sir, for 2 to 3 minutes. Some of the men in the boat said it was the cries of one boat hailing the other. I suppose the reason they said this was not to alarm the women, the ladies in the boat." We should say here that the woman who accused Hitchens of drinking all the whiskey and taking all the blankets was not Molly Brown but another first-class passenger, Leila Meyer. She was taking the trip with her husband, Edgar. The wealthy couple paid £82 for their ticket, which you'll remember would be quite a few $1,000 today. Mrs. Meyer's story is a sad one indeed. Just before she made the trip, her father had died, and when the ship went down, her husband went down with it. She later explained what happened in a rather sad statement. She said, "I tried and tried to get Edgar to come into the lifeboat with me and pleaded to be allowed to stay behind and wait until he could leave, he not caring to leave before all the women had been saved. Mr. Meyer finally persuaded me to leave, reminding me of our 1-year-old child at home. I entered the lifeboat and watched until the Titanic sank, but only for a short time did I see my husband standing beside the rail and assisting other women into boats." Let's now move on to another controversial survival story of the Titanic, this one about the only Japanese passenger on the ship, Masabumi Hosono. Fluent in Russian, he'd been working in Russia on behalf of the Japanese Ministry of Transport. On his way home, he was first to stop in London, and that's when he ended up on the Titanic. When the ship hit the iceberg, Hosono got up to see what was happening. Like most people, he had no idea what happened, so he went up to the boat deck. As the story goes, he was told by a steward to get away from the boat deck. The steward looked at Hosono's Asian appearance and wrongly believed him to be a third-class passenger, folks not allowed on the boat deck. He was actually staying in second class. Things then got worse on the ship. Hosono knew it was definitely going to sink. He later said, "Somehow, I could in no way dispel the feeling of utter dread and desolation." He managed to sneak onto the boat deck all the time, worrying that he might not see his wife and kids again. He helped women and children get into Lifeboat 13, but he saw that there were 2 spaces left when it was lowered. One guy jumped into one space, and Hosono jumped into the other. In terms of protocol back then, this was against the rules, but Hosono wasn't familiar with Western sailing protocols, and he really missed his family. Someone later wrote about his dire situation, saying, "Faced with this textbook moral dilemma, Hosono chose life and lived to regret it." When he was finally aboard the RMS Carpathia rescue ship, he started writing a letter to his wife. This is now a famous document, the only surviving letter from the ship to be written using official Titanic-headed stationery. Since he wrote it when things were so fresh in his mind, it's also interesting to look at today, for it gives a rare glimpse into how things transpired that night. Part of it went, "After the ship sank, there came back again frightful shrills and cries of those drowning in the water. Our lifeboat too was filled with sobbing, weeping children and women worried about the safety of their husbands and fathers. And I too was as much depressed and miserable as they were, not knowing what would become of myself in the long run." Earlier in the letter, he stated that he was indeed ordered to get away from the boat deck and join the third-class passengers. As you know, he wasn't prepared to do this. He wrote, "What a terrible feeling I had. I was alone and screamed." This all sounds very reasonable for a person about to sink into the icy depths of the ocean and never see the smiles on his children's face again, but his story became a huge embarrassment for the Japanese public and the government. For them, the only Japanese guy on the ship had shown utter cowardice. He had shamed the nation, a nation obsessed with honor and dying honorably. The newspapers over there talked about how he'd sneaked onto one of the lifeboats and so let Japan down by not dying as a man should. They talked about how women and children on the Titanic had died while he had sneaked off. The US media joined in, writing stories about brave Western men who'd sacrificed their lives in comparison to Hosono sacrificing nothing. When they referred to him in their stories, they often called him the Japanese stowaway. Because he had chosen not to die an honorable death, Japan made him the subject of something called murahachibu, the Japanese term that means you should be socially ostracized. People wrote him hate mail every day. They said he should have died. They said he should die now. He couldn't walk down the street without people saying bad things about him. He was an outcast. He lived in shame until his death in 1939, but even after that, Japanese media used him as an example, describing him as a man without honor. You can also be sure that his story became a focal point when racist people wanted to talk about Asian people. Well, at least he got to see his wife and kids again. His story isn't much different from that of the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay. The British shipping company was the owner of the Titanic, and when it sank, Ismay was the highest-ranking White Star Line official to survive. Many people called him a coward too, saying the honorable thing to do would have been to go down with the ship. A poem was written about him at the time, which read in part, "The captain stood where the captain should, when a captain's ship goes down. But the owner led when the woman fled, for an owner must not drown." But like Hosono, Ismay did at least help women and children get into lifeboats before he took a place for himself. Also, like Hosono, he lived in shame for the rest of his life. He became terribly depressed and hid from the world, his granddaughter saying he was like a living corpse. He had to testify, of course, which is something we are interested in for this show today. Like everyone else, he heard a bump in the night, but unlike most people, he had to find out what had happened as a matter of urgency. He said he loaded boats with women and children, what he called the natural order of things. When asked why he had gotten on one of the boats, he replied, "The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women, and there was no response. There was no passengers left on the deck." He said he helped to row the lifeboat away, always with his back to the ship. When asked why, he replied, "I did not wish to see her go down." Okay, so it's about time we heard from some third-class survivors of the Titanic. One of them was Rhoda Abbott. She was born in England and later moved to Providence in the US, and that's where she met her future husband, the middleweight champion boxer Stanton Abbott. She divorced him after having 2 kids with him and then took them back to England with her, but the boys never seemed settled in the UK, so she decided to take them back to the US. This is why she was on the Titanic. She was 39 and her 2 boys were 16 and 13. The cabin for all 3 of them cost £20, quite a lot for a third-class cabin, but then there were 3 of them. When the Titanic was pretty much finished, it looked like all 3 of them were going to die. Remember that she was seen as a woman and her boys as grown up. She could have found a lifeboat easier than they could have. Naturally, she wanted to stay with her children. Mrs. Abbott then told the boys that they had one last chance, and they all launched themselves into Collapsible A. It was soon swamped with the weight and started to go down itself. It was fortunate that 5th Officer Harold Lowe picked them up on Collapsible D. She was indeed lucky to survive. Even when she got onto the rescue ship, her legs were badly injured from the cold. After getting off, she couldn't move and spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital. We know a little bit about how things went down because of another third-class survivor who later wrote about Abbott and her kids. She told me that she would get in the lifeboat if there hadn't been so many people around, so she and her sons kept together. She was thankful that 3 of them had stayed with her on that piece of wreckage. The youngest went first, then the other son went. She grew numb and cold and couldn't remember when she got on the Carpathia. There was a piece of cork in her hair, and I managed to get it combed, and it took a long time, but we finally got it out. 537 of the 709 third-class passengers perished, most of whom were men. Nonetheless, some of those who died were women and some were mere girls. For instance, the 10-year-old Catharina van Impe from Belgium died with her father Jean and her mother Rosalie. Of the 53 kids that died on the Titanic, 52 were from third class. Now let's clear something up here. In another show we did about the Titanic disaster, we mentioned the third-class passengers being told to stay in place. We know for a fact that parts of the ship were not accessible to certain passengers, but we also know for a fact that some of the third-class passengers were told to stay in steerage, another name for the place where the third-class passengers stayed. It's complicated, so let's hear what the third-class survivors had to say. In his testimony, third-class passenger Daniel Buckley was asked, "Were you permitted to go up to the top deck without any interference?" He said yes, but then added, "They tried to keep us down at first on our steerage deck. They did not want us to go up to the first-class place at all." He later explained what happened when one guy tried to get out, saying, "There was one steerage passenger there and he was getting up the steps, and just as he was going in a little gate, a fellow came along and chucked him down, threw him down into the steerage place. This fellow got excited and he ran after him, and he could not find him. He got up over the little gate. He did not find him." Another controversial aspect of the disaster is the question of whether there were grills or grates separating the classes. In his testimony, Buckley said there was. He was asked, "There was a gate between the steerage and the first-class deck?" He replied, "Yes, the first-class deck was higher up than the steerage deck, and there were some steps leading up to it, 9 or 10 steps, and a gate just at the top of the steps." He was then asked if it was locked, to which he replied, "It was not locked at the time we made the attempt to get up there, but the sailor or whoever he was locked it, so that this fellow that went up after him broke the lock on it, and he went after that fellow that threw him down. He said that if he could get hold of him, he would throw him into the ocean." He also said that when the gate was broken, he and his third-class passengers had about the same chance of getting a lifeboat. They could not keep them down, he said, which suggests that they were in fact kept down at some point. They weren't locked in like the movie, but they were told to stay in their place. Another third-class survivor said the gates weren't locked, but the stewards kept him and others down. He said the stewards prevented these men from getting up when the order was passed around for the women and children. It seems pretty obvious, seeing that the men had to stay back while working-class women and children were ushered to lifeboats, and given the number of survivors from each class, it's also obvious that third-class men were kept back for as long as possible. As such was the case with American blacksmith Anthony Abbing. He was on his way back to Cincinnati when he only got as far as the Atlantic Ocean. No one really knows how he died, but it's assumed he was locked down in steerage. Some third-class men survived, such as a Norwegian laborer who was heading to the U.S. to do some tough work in South Dakota. His name was Olas Jorgensen Abelseth. He was in a party of 5 on the Titanic, which included a young woman who survived. He later said he and his friends were told to wait on the poop deck, but when the time was around 1:30 and the Titanic was well and truly fudged, they made their way to the boat deck. He said that he saw the last lifeboats leave. That's when sailors were told they could try to get one of the collapsible lifeboats. These were still lifeboats, but they had collapsible canvas sides. Abelseth recounted, "I was standing there and I asked my brother-in-law if he could swim, and he said no. I asked my cousin if he could swim, and he said no. So we could see the water coming up. The bow of the ship was going down, and there was a kind of explosion. We could hear the popping and the cracking, and the deck raised up and got so steep that people could not stand on their feet on the deck, so they fell down and slid on the deck into the water right on the ship. When the water was just 5 feet away, they jumped in. Abelseth suddenly found himself entangled in something but managed to get free. The other guys in his party were gone." Abelseth later said he swam for about 20 minutes in the freezing water. There were dead bodies everywhere, but then he saw collapsible A and tried to get on it, only for someone to tell him to get off as he was going to sink the boat. Still, no one tried to push him off and no one tried to help him on. Their fears were rational, since when Abelseth did manage to drag himself over the side, the boat was full of water. He remained submerged in it until they were later picked up. One man froze to death with his arms around Abelseth. He later said, "We did not talk very much, except that we would say 1, 2, 3 and scream together for help." As dawn broke and a ship was in the distance, Abelseth grabbed a guy from New Jersey whose face he remembered. The guy just said, "Who are you? Let me be." Abelseth later testified, "I held him up like that for a while, but I got tired and cold, and I took a little piece of a small board, a lot of which were floating around there, and laid it under his head on the edge of the boat to keep his head from the water, but it was not more than about a half or so hour when he died." When they were picked up by the Carpathia at around 7 a.m., Abelseth was handed a warm blanket and given some coffee and brandy, but he had to sleep on the deck in his wet clothes. He was still a third-class citizen. He later testified saying he and others in third-class passengers were told not to move from the steerage and that a ship was coming to rescue everyone. Some were not happy about this, with Abelseth stating, "There were a lot of steerage people there that were getting on one of those cranes that they had on deck, that they used to lift things with. They can lift about 2.5 tons, I believe. These steerage passengers were crawling along this over the railing and way up to the boat deck, and a lot of them were doing that." Senator William Alden Smith then asked, "They cannot get up there any other way?" Abelseth replied, "The gate was shut." Nonetheless, he did add that he didn't feel the passengers down there were purposefully held back. That part of the ship filled with water so fast that they really had to get out of there fast. When he was asked if it filled quickly, he replied, "Oh yes, there was a friend of mine who told me that he went back for something he wanted and there was so much water that he couldn't get to his room." This testimony is important in regard to third-class passengers being locked behind gates. Although he seems to contradict himself at times, but forgetting about that, we think this bit of his testimony relating to being on the boat deck is very, very touching. "We did not talk very much. Just a little ways from us, I saw there was an old couple standing there on the deck, and I heard this man say to the lady, 'Go into the lifeboat and get saved.' He put his hand on his shoulder, and I think he said, 'Please get into the lifeboat and get saved.' She replied, 'No, let me stay with you.' I could not say who it was, but I saw that he was an old man. I did not pay much attention to him because I did not know him." Very few people were alive on the ship as long as Abelseth was, but one man certainly outdid him. He was the guy we talked about at the beginning of the show. His name was Charles John Joffin. The Liverpoolian was the chief baker on the ship. When he wasn't baking bread in Liverpool, he was going to the pub with his friends to make use of his monthly wage of £12. As you know, that would have gotten him a seat in the third class on the Titanic. But he was working, not traveling on that fateful day. At about 12:30, he was told he could get into Lifeboat 10 as its captain, but he turned down that and instead helped the women and children. He might have only been 5 foot 3.5 inches, but he was a strong guy for sure. Some women refused to go, either scared or not wanting to leave their husbands behind. But Joffin didn't give them much choice. He virtually threw them into the boats. At one point, he went back to the pantry and had some liquor. We don't know how much, but he was merry as the Titanic went down. As things started crashing and bending all around him, he took it all in stride. He later testified and said, indeed, while all the commotion was going on, he sneaked off for a tipple of liquor. He said at one point, that was just after I'd passed the first lot of bread up and I went down to my room for a drink. As a matter of fact, and as I was coming back, I followed up my men onto the deck. Later in his testimony, he said, I went down to my room and had a drop of liquor that I had down there, and then while I was there, I saw the old doctor, possibly Dr. O'Loughlin, and spoke to him, and then I came upstairs again. So he was pretty smashed when the boat finally went down. He admitted that himself. He was on the Titanic as it became almost vertical and people were spilling everywhere, screaming, bones breaking, old and young, flying like ants shaken from a plate. He said he looked on in horror when the bodies had piled up in one spot. He said he just held on when the Titanic broke in half and went down as if an elevator. When he was asked how frightening it was, he replied, there was no great shock or anything. What a guy. But if you've been to Liverpool, you know it's a tough old town. He was having another drink in the pantry when things started getting crazy. Talking about the grim end when the ship was done, he said, I was just wondering what next to do when she went. He was then in the water for 2 hours. He said about that, I did not attempt to get anything to hold on to until I reached a collapsible, but that was daylight. He was asked, then you were in the water for a long time? He said, I should say over 2 hours, sir. Now this shouldn't have been possible. Others died in mere minutes. Some got through, say, 20 or 30 minutes, but 2 hours treading water at that temperature? How did he do it? When asked if he felt calm, he replied, it's just like a pond. By not getting shocked by the situation, he helped himself a lot. He even stayed calm when a collapsible saw him but refused to let him on. He testified, I tried to get on it, but I was pushed off it, and I what you call hung around it. He also said he was colder in the boat than in the water. When a lifeboat came into sight, he was one of the guys that jumped back into the water and swam toward it, so there was more space in the collapsible. In his testimony, it almost sounds like the commissioner can't believe his ears. At one point, the commissioner says, you've said you thought it was about 2 hours before you saw this collapsible, and then you spent some time with the collapsible. How long do you suppose it was after you got into the collapsible that you were taken into the lifeboat? Joffin replied, I should say we were on the collapsible about half an hour. The commissioner asked, that means that for some 2.5 hours you were in the water. Joffin said, practically yes. We don't actually know how he survived that long in the water, although some say it was the booze. Actually, alcohol doesn't really help you when you're fighting hypothermia, so we reckon the fact that he stayed so calm was more to the point. He actually lived until he was 78, taking in final breaths in New Jersey. His story was talked about for years, so on his death certificate where it asked occupation, it was written Baker on the Titanic. April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic is already filled with water. Above the din of steam coming from the safety valves, an officer is shouting, "Women and children first." He's acutely aware that there aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. A woman looking radiant in her dinner dress clings onto her weeping child as they're guided onto a boat. Her husband stoically nods in their direction. When they're out of sight, he just stares into the distance. He knows that's where he's heading, into the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Another passenger, a complete stranger, hands him a Camel filterless cigarette. "Do you think we'll make it?" he says. The husband doesn't reply. He just keeps looking forward, transfixed on the dark. With great violence, the ship suddenly tilts. A giant wave sweeps many passengers into the ocean. Can this man survive even though he won't make it onto a lifeboat? What were a person's chances of survival in that frigid ocean? Today, you're gonna find out, and you might just be surprised. Okay, so the ship hit that iceberg at about 11:40 p.m. As you already know because you've watched the movie 15 times, it didn't just sink in the blink of an eye. In fact, for the first hour, the majority of the 2,224 people on board had no idea just over 1,500 of them were about to have a date with Davy Jones's locker. The ship was letting in water from the beginning, but the flooding was incremental and slow at first. It took about 40 minutes for the loading of the first lifeboats to happen, boats that were filled with only women and children. This was somewhat problematic since some of the boats hit the water only partially filled because not enough women and kids could be put in them. When lifeboat number 7 rode away from the sinking ship at about 12:45, only 28 passengers out of a possible 65 were on it. It wasn't until about 1:20 a.m. when the flooding got much worse. That's about the time the ship tilted more and those on board really understood the gravity of the situation. It's when couples said their tearful goodbyes and when the guy in our intro saw his beloved child for the last time. Well, if he died. We'll come back to that soon. We hope you have your fingers crossed for this dude. And just in case you're wondering, it wasn't as if all the women and children were spared that appointment with the freezing cold ocean. Of the 412 adult women on board, 108 died. Of the 112 kids on board, 56 died. That's a 75% and 50% survival rate, respectively, which isn't bad going at all. The men did have it worse. Of the 1,680 guys on the ship, 1,357 ended up with an unwanted sea burial. That's only a 19% survival rate. Add that up and you get 1,521 deaths. Some sources say 1,503 died, others say 1,517 died. Let's just agree on the number of deaths was in the early 1500s. Titanic the movie wanted to encourage you to be angry because it portrayed a scenario in which wealthier people had a greater chance of survival. This was a British-run ship. Still, today that country judges you by the strength of your accent and then puts you into a class bracket. And back then, people were a lot more obsessed with class. Titanic the movie got it right in some ways. The wealthy did fare better than the poor, although that bit where the third-class plebes are locked behind doors down below is totally fictional. Let's break this down, something we'll call class mortality rates. If you were a rich woman, you'd almost had it made. Of the 141 women who bought first-class tickets, only 4 bit the dust. That's a 97% survival rate. One posh kid died, so that sucked for him. Of the 171 men in first class, 105 died. Get this though, of the 179 women in third class, 91 died. 55 out of 80 kids who were staying in that crappy part of the ship were killed. 391 out of 450 of the men in third class died. In terms of betting, if you were a woman without much cash, you were an odds-on favorite to die. In all, only 1/4 of third-class folks survived, when 62% of first-class folks survived. It also turned out that Americans had a better chance of survival percentage-wise than the Brits, and it was those two nationalities that made up the bulk of the passengers. So we can conclude being a working-class family from Wolverhampton was not the ideal demographic for sailing around icebergs in those days. To give you an example, let's look at the Sage family, who was immigrating from Britain to the land of the free. Mr. Sage and Mrs. Sage boarded the Titanic in England with third-class tickets and 9 kids in tow. None of them made it to America. The Anderson family from Sweden also had a third-class ticket, and all 7 of them perished, as did the English Goodwins, also a family of 7, and another family looking for a new start in the USA. Okay, so let's get back to our stoic man who's just bid his farewell to his wife and kid. Not too long after he smoked that cigarette, the ship tilted 30 to 45 degrees. The cacophony was absolutely deafening because the ship was coming apart in the water. The lights were still partly on, but then there was flickering followed by darkness. The people in lifeboats looked on in shock at the shadow of the behemoth sinking into the depths like a slain sea monster from a Greek myth. The crashing, the screaming, the surreal image, It was almost unbearable to look at. On board, some people were being thrown down the now heavily tilted ship. Some of them were literally pulverized after being smashed against fixed objects. Others flew through the air like ants in a hurricane. As the ship pointed skyward, those who'd managed to cling together in groups fell en masse, hundreds of feet. Some of those people ended up in the icy water, and believe it or not, a few of them were still in one piece. Others were not so lucky. They were cast into the sea only to be whacked by all the debris that came from the ship. Stuff like giant pieces of timber and bits of beds. The theory is some of the debris went down, but being buoyant, it came back up with a vengeance, and it hit the ill-starred swimmers. Maybe that was better than dying slowly in the freezing water. To say those survivors were cold would be an understatement. One of them later said the feeling was like being pierced by 1,000 knives. The temperature was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which didn't give people much of a chance of surviving. People did survive, though. One of those people later said all he could hear was a terrible moaning sound, a situation he described as being horrifying, mysterious, supernatural. Some of the folks in the lifeboats not so far away said they felt hopeless as they peered into the darkness and listened to the poor souls whose moans were carried by the fog. The situation was dire, to say the least. You see, water is very dense. In fact, it's over 800 times more dense than air. That might not mean much to you, but it will if you ever find yourself immersed in very cold water. What it means is that in the water, you cool down a lot faster than you do when outside in the open. In fact, the chilling is about 25 times faster. Let's say you weren't one of those passengers that swallowed a load of water on impact and so your lungs didn't drown. You'd still be breathing very heavily and your teeth would be chattering as if they were powered by a generator. You'd also have the most horrific headache. The reason is nerves. They send a message to your good old brain and your brain thinks, this guy's head is freezing, better send some warm blood up there. Your brain is now your enemy because the warm blood causes swelling and you get that terrible headache. But why do people shiver and why do their teeth chatter? The reason is shivering activates muscles to get moving, and this warms up the tissues in your body. Shivering is good for you. As for those mad chattering teeth, that's because all the muscles moving causes the jaw to spasm. If your teeth ever start chattering and you're not cold at all, you best go see the doctor ASAP, or a psychiatrist. Back to our man in the ocean. He's now been in the water for a few minutes and is fortunate enough to find some flotsam to grab a hold of in the shape of a rather well-designed cabinet. He's hyperventilating due to shock, but that's not so good for him. Too much of that can release too much air from the blood, and that can lead to reduced blood acidity. The upshot of that can be fainting, which is not great when you're in the water. But our guy, he's one of those strong, silent types, and he ain't gonna let a bit of hyperventilation bother him. Plus, he's got that cabinet to hold on to. The problem is, he's now shivering so much he almost looks like he's about to have a seizure. As we said, shivering is your friend in times of coldness, but it's a different matter when you're in the ocean or perhaps stuck on a mountaintop. That's because in those situations, you really need your muscles to work for you. Our guy is shaking around on his cabinet, and that's really not ideal. He needs his muscles working fine, he needs his strength, but because of all that moving around at times, he almost loses his grip. He's strong, but he's no Wim Hof, aka the Iceman. Not the contract killer guy, but the Dutch guy that's trained his body to withstand extremely cold temperatures. Because our survivor is not trained like that, his brain is in a kind of fight or flight mode. As you likely know, a bit of this is good for you, but too many stress hormones firing up that amygdala in your brain is not good. All of this stress has caused our gracious man to have some internal problems. For one, his arteries have shrunk, and so his heart isn't getting the blood it needs. That means his starved heart is pumping like crazy. Meanwhile, that selfish brain of his is portioning out the blood to only the most vital organs, including it. What that means is all those less important parts of the body aren't getting as much blood, and some parts are going numb. When those parts get really cold, they no longer work so well. And when the bloodless parts get super cold, the extremities can get frostbite. Suffice to say, our survivor has cold toes. Now he's been in the water for about 10 minutes and basically he can't feel his feet. His greatest risk right now isn't hypothermia, although you'd think it would be. The biggest problem is the fact that when his legs and arms get too numb, he won't be able to either cling to that cabinet or even swim. This is known as cold incapacitation, and it's likely the reason most of those waterbound Titanic passengers died. Most people in that water were slightly incapacitated after only 2 minutes, but after 15 minutes, they were virtually paralyzed. In terms of drowning, that usually gets you before the hypothermia does. That's not happened yet, though. What's also a stroke of luck is even though his heart is working overtime, he hasn't had a heart attack due to the narrowing of blood vessels. It's just good fortune that the star of today's show is as fit as a fiddle. To survive in freezing cold water, strength, conditioning, and a healthy ticker are required. Even so, his body temperature is not what it used to be an hour ago. His regular 98.6 has been reduced, and if it goes below 90, he can say goodbye to consciousness, which again is not great when you're in the water. Still, people aren't all the same, and so while some of those moaners kicked the bucket after only 15 minutes, 20 minutes have passed and our guy is still holding onto that cabinet. Albeit he's now turned a shade of blue and is not sure if he has any legs any longer. Lucky for him, most of his upper half is on that floating debris. At around the 25-minute mark, he's moved from stage 1 hypothermia to stage 2. The first stage includes what we've already talked about, but now things get worse. We should say here that some people are just amazing. The record for surviving a body temperature drop in the water was someone who was once pulled out and lived to tell the tale, even though their body temperature went down to 13 degrees Celsius or 55.4 degrees Fahrenheit. That shouldn't happen, but it did. He's now feeling kinda tired, and he's even stopped shivering. But that's actually a really bad thing. Even though he feels better, he's losing his mind, and though he's able to hold on to his raft, he's kinda drifting in and out of reality. Part of him is in the water, and the other part is having a picnic with his dear wife and kid on an atypical English summer's day when it actually didn't rain. He's tripping out because his brain cells aren't getting the oxygen they need. This can also work out in his favor, since when cold, the brain doesn't need as much oxygen. What that means is he could go into cardiac arrest, but his brain would still be functioning. That person we just mentioned, who holds the world record for having the lowest body temperature and surviving, actually went into cardiac arrest and survived 40 minutes in an air pocket before being pulled out of the water. Since her brain was in chill mode and working, she was revived and later ended up telling her story on CNN. Okay, so he's in stage 2 hypothermia and things aren't looking good at all. But then a lifeboat approaches and it brings him out of his reverie about that picnic. He can hardly be excited given his body is so numb, but he can hold on. He's not out of the water yet though, both literally and figuratively, because there's a chance he might die from post-rescue collapse. This happens to about 20% of people who've suffered some serious hypothermia after being in cold water. A person can be dragged out of the water and go into shock, or they might suffer a serious heart arrhythmia, or their blood pressure might dangerously drop. That doesn't happen, and our man became one of 14 people pulled from the water. Those lifeboats could have actually saved a lot more people, most of them in fact if they'd been on the scene earlier. He certainly was a resilient guy because the rescue took 30 minutes and by that time almost all the moaning in the water had stopped. Believe it or not, after an hour when hundreds of dead bodies were seen floating in the water, 4 other men were found. 3 survived and 1 died from post-rescue collapse. Our guy was fine. He went on to write a book called Why I'm Never Going on Vacation Again, and he even stopped smoking. You all know the story. It's about 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, and Britain's largest passenger liner, the RMS Titanic, finds itself in a bit of trouble. First, there's a bang, followed by an eerie period of silence, and before you can say, "Blimey, you just hit that old spot," the unsinkable ship starts taking on water. Just over 2 hours later, the Titan of the high seas goes under, and just over 1,500 people acquaint themselves with Davy Jones's locker. It's a bad day indeed for all involved. But a century and a bit later, we could all laugh about it. Or can we? Because what if everything you thought you knew about the sinking of the Titanic was wrong? What if there was no catastrophic iceberg impact? What if someone wanted that ship to go down? What if Jack and Rose didn't even exist? Just kidding. But really, there are a lot of things you don't know about the Titanic. The word on some dimly lit streets is that the ship's destruction involved power, greed, and ultra-rich families. Was there a religious curse on the ship, or did it even sink at all? Do you think that's crazy? Trust us, there are believers. They are out there, spreading the word on internet forums. Today, we'll do a deep dive into their theories. Let's start with the possibility of a giant piece of floating ice not wrecking the ship, but the military doing it. Okay, so you all know World War I started in 1914 and you know the Titanic went down in 1912. But did you know that at this point in time, Britain saw Germany as its biggest threat to dominance in Europe? Did you know the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted nothing more than to build a bigger, better naval fleet than Britain, a country that proudly claimed to rule the waves? When the Titanic went down, Germany already had very powerful U-boats, one that could sink a huge passenger liner. Around 3 years after the Titanic sank, a U-boat destroyed a British passenger liner off the coast of Ireland. a sinking that killed 1,198 people. So, would it be too much of a stretch of the imagination to ask if a U-boat sunk the Titanic? Was Germany flexing its muscles? Was it gearing up for war? This theory might sound far-fetched, but trust us, some people give it a lot of credence. It's arguably more believable than some of the far-out theories you'll hear later. After the accident, both passengers and crew were grilled by the US Senate. Some of them said they had never heard an impact at all, but they did hear what sounded like explosions under the water. And get this, passengers in lifeboats said they saw a rescue ship approaching, a ship they thought was crewed by Americans coming to rescue them, but the American ship was nowhere near. So you have to ask yourself, what was that ship they saw? A few sailors on the sinking Titanic also said they saw a ship in the distance, and now some people think that that could have been a U-boat surfacing for a short while to admire the damage it had caused. Okay, so let's move on to a theory that the Titanic didn't even sink at all, and this isn't even the strangest theory. The British had built another massive ship called the RMS Olympic. This beast was the older sister of the Titanic, and both ships looked very much alike. In fact, they were almost identical. They were owned by an outfit called the International Mercantile Marine Group, and that was controlled by none other than J.P. Morgan, the Wolf of Wall Street in those days. In case you're wondering, the Titanic was registered as a British passenger liner, but it was actually owned by the American Morgan, as was the Olympic. In 1911, the Olympic collided with a Royal Navy ship, and the accident caused severe damage. The theory goes that because the Olympic was blamed for the collision, its insurers, Lloyd's of London, wouldn't pay up. That cost the International Mercantile Marine Group a lot of cash. To make matters worse, the other big ship, the Titanic, wasn't yet finished and the work on it had been delayed. This meant no ocean liners in the water and a big loss of money. So, what to do in that situation? Some people believe that the Olympic was patched up, not perfectly, but at least it could sail. After that, it was kind of a switch. They said that the damaged Olympic was the new Titanic. The theory sounds more believable when you hear that the crew on the Titanic said the ship listed to port in the water. That means tilted to the left, which is what would have likely happened if the damaged Olympic was in the water. Okay, so why would they do that? Well, to have at least one ship in the water, for one thing. But there's more, and this is where it all gets insidious. You see, if a damaged ship sailed along icebergs over a long distance, there was every chance it would sink, and it would look like an accident too. So the insurers would have to pay that. If it happened, JP and his company of wolves on Wall Street would get their cash for the banged-up vessel, and they could put the real Titanic in the water. Everyone's a winner. Oh, except the 1,500-plus dead people. Some theorists believe that they didn't actually want people to die because the damage was so small JP and friends thought everyone would be rescued when it went down. This all sounds like a Dr. Evil kind of plan, and there are more than enough people that want to really believe that all those bankers are forged deep in the pits of hell. But there's one reason, and one reason alone, why the tale doesn't ring true. You see, the construction number of the Titanic was 401, and the construction number of its sister was 400. When bits of the Titanic were pulled from the ocean bed, they had the 401 construction number on them. When the Olympic was turned into scrap, nowhere was the number 401 found. J.P. Morgan isn't off the hook yet. Another theory is that he wanted some people on the ship dead. Sinking the Titanic to slay some enemies might seem a bit excessive, but you have to remember that some people think the Earth is flat and Queen Elizabeth is a lizard inside human skin. The conspiracy theorists say JP wanted very much to establish the Federal Reserve Bank in the US, but in his way stood a handful of people that didn't think it was such a good idea. Three of them were the wealthy and powerful people named John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. Guess what? They all went down with the Titanic and JP got his bank. The theory asserts JP was supposed to have a seat on the ship, but he canceled the trip at the very last minute. Oh, what good fortune. You read that on Reddit and now you know bankers equal evil, JP Morgan equals murderous villain. But wait for a moment before you go on the dark web and buy yourself a Kalashnikov to take on the world's bankers. A little bit more research tells you that his cancellation was due to the fact that he was having some problems getting his art collection from Europe over to the States. There's also evidence that when JP canceled, his alleged mortal enemy Guggenheim hadn't even bought his ticket. As for those three guys being against the establishment of the Fed, there aren't any news clippings from back then that had them going on record saying they were. In fact, Strauss discussed the Fed in the New York Times and said he was for it, not against it. No good conspiracy theory could float without the Rothschilds being mentioned, so we should add that some people believe it was that family that was behind the murder of the wealthy triad. Okay, so if JP Morgan didn't do it, then who did? We're guessing the first thing that comes to your mind is an ancient Egyptian mummy. Those damn mummies, still sticking their noses in everything. This is how the tale goes. One of the people that died on the Titanic was a guy named William Stead. He was a newspaper editor and spiritualist who held some pretty far-out views. Hey, he's said to be the father of tabloid journalism, so far-out views were his mainstay. He was a brave man too, seeing that he helped women and children into lifeboats and gave his life jacket away. He was actually last seen with one of the guys we just mentioned, John Jacob Astor. Both of them were holding onto a raft, but their feet iced up and they went under. Prior to going on that trip, Stead had often talked about a mummy's curse. The curse goes back to some English dudes that bought the mummy case of the Princess of Amun-Ra, and after that, things didn't go too well for them. The case got back to England eventually, but there it sat ready to curse the country. To cut a long story short, everyone who bought it or went near it died, or so we're told. In 1912, a rich American was said to have bought the case, and he didn't believe in all those silly superstitious tales. He wanted to ship the thing over to the US, on board the Titanic. It's a fact that the tabloid creator Stead wrote about what later became known as the unlucky mummy, and so people put 2 and 2 together and got 5, saying that because Stead died, the mummy must have been on that ship. It wasn't. Still, one of the survivors on the Titanic had a story to tell. He was back on dry land. He described how Stead had been telling people on the ship how the mummy's curse was going to destroy London. This made headlines. The Washington Post ran one that went, "Ghost of the Titanic, vengeance of hoodoo mummy followed the man who wrote its history." So much for the tabloids being the only ridiculous news sources. Let's get 2 things straight. No mummy case was on that ship. It's in the British Museum as you watch this. Stead was patently crazy, but we'll forgive him for giving away his life jacket. So if a mummy mad that her coffin had been plundered didn't do it, then who would make an obvious next choice to blame for the sinking of the Titanic? God. It was God that did it, but not the Catholic God, a Protestant God. You see, the construction number for the Titanic was 401, as you already know, but some people say it had another number on the hull that was 390904. What does that say if you look at it in a mirror? No Pope. The story goes that one day someone in the yard was straightening his tie in the mirror and he saw the number. My God, he thought it's a sign that that ship is doomed. The poor Catholics that built the ship in the Belfast shipyard were sure that it meant the Titanic was in for a rough ride. The truth is that the number never actually appeared on the ship. Another fact is that the people who worked in the shipyard weren't Catholic but Protestant. It's also believed that the no Pope rumor didn't start circulating until the 50s. So, if it wasn't the fault of the Germans, or JP Morgan, or a mummy, or God, then who could it have been? Well, we can blame the iceberg if we want to be very boring and factual, but we can also add something to the story. You might not know that one of the seamen that was supposed to sail on the Titanic was named David Blair, or Davy to his friends. He was one of the guys that sailed on the ship when it was making its first trial runs, but just before it took that perilous journey over the ocean, he was assigned a different job. He was really bummed about it too, writing to his sister saying, "This is a magnificent ship. I feel very disappointed I'm not to make her first voyage." Blair got off lucky, but did he do something naughty after getting the snub? It's a fact that when he left the ship, he took some keys with him, keys that opened a locker to where a pair of binoculars were kept. This was the only locker up where the crow's nest was, and that's the place you really need binoculars when you're looking for things like, I don't know, icebergs. 2 of the lookouts actually survived, and when Congress asked them if binoculars would have helped them to better see that iceberg, both men said yes, most likely. Congress asked, "How much sooner do you think you'd have seen it?" To which one man replied, "Enough to get out of the way." So there you go. Human error was likely to blame. We're sorry to disappoint you. The theories are much more fun. On April 14, 1912, the so-called unsinkable ship called the Titanic hit an iceberg. At first, most of the passengers were unaware of what had actually happened. A couple hours later, many of them were screaming for their lives and being flung through the air as the ship listed steeply starboard and then plunged into the ocean. Some of the fortunate people had gotten away in lifeboats, but for many, especially the poorer passengers, it was the end. Over 1,500 people lost their lives that day, including entire families. Some died quickly, others could be heard moaning in the freezing cold water. As one survivor put it, there was a chorus of shrieks and then just a deathly silence. The question is, did any of the dead rise again? First of all, we should ask, where is the Titanic today? It broke into 2 main parts, each of which lies about 1/3 of a mile away from each other. They're about 12,500 feet down and about 370 miles from the coast of Newfoundland. Not surprisingly, a large site of debris formed with parts of the ship and people's belongings being scattered on the bed of the ocean. As for the bodies of the dead, well, they were eaten by any number of sea creatures a long time before the first expedition was launched to go and survey the wreck. If some parts of them are still down there is still not entirely agreed upon. The first discovery of the wreckage didn't happen until 1985. It wasn't because of a lack of want, though. Many rich folks who lost their friends or family on that ship wanted to sponsor an expedition, but the fact was there wasn't enough funding, and the technology in those days wasn't good enough to get down that far. Then, on September 1, 1985, an expedition led by American and French oceanographers finally found something. It was the massive boiler of the Titanic. The next day, they found more parts, including hundreds of thousands of bits of debris that had been dispersed over a 2-mile radius. What was surprising was that some of the things they found were in really good condition, given the fact that they'd been lying down there for over 70 years. Since that time, quite a few things have been brought back from the wreckage site. Haunting items that, as you'll see, turn up in exhibits from time to time. Watches were one thing that was found, with them stopping at the time their owners went into the water. They may not be haunted, but looking at them certainly makes your hair stand on end. Other things, such as deck chairs, coins, cutlery, furniture, and dishes have been brought back up from the depths. As for the dead, it's very unlikely any parts of them would have survived that long deep under the water. Their flesh would have been eaten and the bones would have dissolved because of the seawater. Remnants of humans have been found before in old wrecks, although the likelihood of that happening is not high. The question for some people, though, is what about the souls of the dead? These days, there's a new kind of expedition, one with paranormal in mind. Some folks are now searching for the ghosts of the Titanic. Okay, so if you went down there now with your buddies, because that's the kind of thing y'all do, you'll find pairs of shoes, you'll find bits of old clothing, but you'd struggle to find the people who had worn the things. There are some people, however, who claim that if you get close enough to the wreck, you can hear the ghostly voices of those that perished. In 2010, a group of more than 20 paranormal investigators wanted to capture these sounds and show them to the world. We hate to disappoint you guys, but it seems that expedition never got off the ground. Not only that, the expedition, called the Titanic Endeavour Tour, was said to have offended relatives of the victims once they found out about it. Okay, so that didn't work out, but there's more. There's the story of the ghost who was the captain of the Titanic who died on that fateful night. His name was Edward Smith. It seems his soul is a bit restless these days, if you believe that sort of thing. In 1977, he may have popped up for a chat. As the story goes, Leonard Bishop, the second officer of the ship called the SS Winterhaven, was giving a tour of his ship to some quiet Englishman. The man was very polite but asked a lot of questions about the ship. Bishop later remarked that he was taken aback by how obsessed the man was about the details of the ship. He also said that at the time he was sure he'd seen the guy before, but he wasn't quite sure where. A couple of years passed and Bishop saw a photo of the man who'd asked all those questions on the tour. He told his friend that he'd met that guy, to which his friend replied, "You can't have. He went down with the Titanic. He was the captain." Maybe you just can't hold a good man down. Because in 2018, a couple of folks taking a selfie in a pub in Northern Ireland had quite the shock when they looked at the image. To them, it seemed that the ghost of Captain Smith had photobombed them. Apparently, the pub they were in had some connection to the Titanic, and that's why you can find lots of Titanic memorabilia there. They said at the time of the photo they felt something cold rush down their backs. They even sent the picture to a ghost hunting outfit called Paranormal Investigations UK and were told that something indeed didn't look right about it. Mr. Smith, it seems, won't properly give up the ghost because it's been said by some that he haunts other places. In 2012, tenants who lived in the home where he spent his childhood said that for lots of years odd things happened in the house. They said that previous tenants of the 2-bedroom property had said the same thing. The usual stuff, like things going bump in the night, happened on occasion. But it was also said that sometimes a rush of very cold wind would for no reason pass through the place. Another time the kitchen flooded. But there wasn't any good reason why it happened. The water seemed to have come out of the faucet itself. That or the renters were somewhat embarrassed about leaving the water running. Then there's the story of the captain appearing in a mirror he once owned. When he didn't return from his trip, that mirror fell into the hands of his servant, Miss Ethelwine. She said sometimes when she looked in the mirror, she saw the captain looking back at her. In a letter, her sister-in-law told a friend, "She always spooked me when she said that at times she could still see Captain Smith's face in it on the anniversary of when the Titanic was sunk." We also found sources of what we might call the dubious kind, stating that there's evidence of ships passing the wreckage site and people on the ship saying they saw little orbs of light flying around. The same sources state that submarines passing through the area have said their radio signals have been blocked. We attempted to look further into this and just can't find any evidence. Therefore, we think someone just made it up, and it's been repeated numerous times. There's an equally dubious story that surfaced in 2009. A woman claiming to have visited the Titanic Belfast Museum said something strange happened to her when the Titanic's distress signal was played. She said she suddenly felt very anxious and started to experience what sounds like a panic attack, only for her to feel a hand on her shoulder and to hear the words, "It's okay." When she looked up, there was no one there. Perhaps the biggest buzz regarding the ghosts of the Titanic comes from the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. That's a strange place to mention when talking about the ill-fated ship, but it's where you can find over 200 artifacts taken from the Titanic. One of the people that worked on the exhibit once said this: "Let me tell you, when you're closing this place up at 11 p.m. midnight, you hear stuff." He said he's felt people grabbing at him that weren't there. He said he's heard giggles and also heard his name being called. On one occasion, he said he heard an orchestra playing. The question is, does he have a vested interest in saying that? This is how he once responded to skeptics. "I'll say this a million times and on my deathbed, and maybe come back and say it after my death. I would not lie to you. What I'm asking you is to keep an open mind. Some of the docents and even guests have had serious experiences here. One such person was a photographer. He was getting ready to take some snaps when he saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress with a white collar walk down the grand staircase. This is part of the exhibit that was roped off to the public, so he wondered what she was doing there. He asked her if she'd like to have a photo taken, to which she just ignored him. The next thing he knew, she was right next to him. Again, he asked if she wanted her photo taken, and this time she just seemed to vanish." Then there's the story of the ghost of Frederick Fleet, who it's said has been seen at the exhibit. This guy was one of the lookouts on the Titanic, a man that told people about the approaching iceberg when there was no way of getting around it. He was also one of the fortunate folks that made it back to dry land, but with guilt on his mind, and after a series of bad events, he took his own life. Apparently his ghost has been seen on the deck, still keeping lookout. Now, for a man whose name was tainted after the ship went down. He was a managing director of the firm that built the Titanic, and he was on it when it sank. Except he didn't stay behind with all the other men. He jumped ship as soon as he could. His name was J. Bruce Ismay. Leaving women and children behind was not a good look for him, and he was called a coward by the newspapers of the time. He was the bad guy in the movie Titanic, or at least one of them. People have since said this bad guy image was perhaps a little unfair. Anyway, it seems some ghosts of the Titanic still don't like the man. His portrait hangs in the Vegas exhibit, only one day it was found on the floor when the workers arrived. It's said that staff looked at the video footage and saw the picture shake violently and then dismount the wall. Still, we looked for the footage, we didn't find it. We also didn't find any first-hand accounts from the staff, so again, that might be another tall tale that's been repeated to death. Not so long ago, ghost hunters went to the Titanic exhibit when it was at the Georgia Aquarium. Their conclusion was that there was some paranormal activity there. That's because they said they felt and recorded strange cold areas. They said that they saw apparitions wandering around, and one guy said he felt a hand on his shoulder. Maybe that happened, or maybe viewer numbers wouldn't look so good if these ghost hunters never claimed anything spooky was going on. Then again, a retired architectural draftsman from Virginia named Wyatt Jason Moore has something else to say about the Titanic's ghosts. He built a massive replica of the ship, an impressive feat in itself since he made it almost perfect after studying many photographs. He said he soon started to hear noises coming from it, and when he took photos of the ship, he'd sometimes see what looked like little people in the camera lens. "I'd leave them alone and they'd leave me alone," he once told the media. On the 31st of March 1911, 100,000 people gathered at the dock in Belfast, Ireland to watch the launch of the new Royal Mail ship Titanic, the result of an intense international rivalry between the United Kingdom and France over who could field the most luxurious and fastest cruise liner in the world. The Titanic well earned her name and was at the time the largest and most luxurious cruise liner in the world, measuring over 882 feet from bow to stern and 175 feet high. The Titanic weighed in at over 46,000 tons. 1 year and 1 month later, the Titanic would be on her maiden voyage to New York, loaded full of passengers. On the night of April 14, 1912, 4 days out of Southampton, England, the Titanic struck an iceberg and proved that she was without a doubt not an unsinkable ship. Over 1,500 passengers and crew died, at the time the greatest ocean catastrophe in history. Fast forward 7 decades and the famed oceanographer Robert Ballard is on a secret U.S. Navy mission in the North Atlantic. In 1982, Ballard had approached the U.S. Navy and asked for funding to develop his robotic submersible technology, which he hoped to use to discover the Titanic one day. The Navy agreed, but with the condition that once the technology was ready for use, he helped them locate the wrecks of 2 downed nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion. 3 years later, and Ballard finds himself in the North Atlantic, using his submersibles to locate the wrecks of the Thresher and the Scorpion. He has plotted Titanic's course as well as the location of the rescue of its surviving passengers, and he realizes that the Titanic is likely located directly between the 2 downed subs. He asks Vice Admiral Ronald Thunman, the then Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Submarine Warfare, for permission to search for the Titanic en route from one sub to the next. But Thunman very sternly reminds Ballard that his mission is to locate the downed subs. The entire expedition is being secretly funded by the Navy, and Ballard is granted permission to search for the Titanic only after he locates the subs, and then only if time remains. Luckily for Ballard, he manages to locate and photograph the downed subs per the Navy's specifications, with just 12 days left on the mission. He uses the time to search for the Titanic, though nobody, least of all the Navy, believes he'll find it. To the shock of all involved, Ballard manages to do just that, and the legend of the Titanic is reborn for a new generation. Today, the Titanic is nothing more than a rusting hulk. It rests almost 2.5 miles below the surface of the Atlantic, where no light can reach it. This fact and the incredible pressures at that depth, coupled with the very low temperatures, means that scientists believe the wreck would remain well preserved for many decades to come. After all, the ship now rests in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, and the lack of life dramatically slows down corrosion. In 1991, scientists from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, collected samples of what looked like icicles but are actually formations of rust called rusticles. Breaking a few off from the ship, the scientists brought them back to a lab and discovered that they were teeming with life. An exciting discovery. However, it wasn't until 2010 that scientists led by Henrietta Mann at Dalhousie University took it upon themselves to actually identify what type of life it was. For years, NASA had been looking at the possibility of extreme forms of life, known as extremophiles, surviving in places like Titan and Europa in conditions that were once thought inhospitable to life. The discovery of bacteria living in hydrothermal vents deep under the ocean and even under the Arctic ice has led to scientists exploring what other environments bacteria could survive in, with the thinking being that if life can survive in extremely inhospitable places here on Earth, perhaps it can do the same in similar places across the solar system. The scientists re-examining the rusticles were able to isolate just one species of bacteria. And to their surprise, it turned out to be completely new to science. This new bacteria was termed Halomonas titanicae after the ship and has the ability to survive in crushing pressures and freezing cold, salty water. A cousin of this bacteria is known to survive in salty marshes where the salinity can vary dramatically due to evaporation and has evolved the ability to produce special compounds that can prevent their cells from bursting or shrinking due to too much or too little salt. Incredibly, this deep-sea cousin somehow survived the trip to the bottom of the ocean and put this adaptation to great use, propagating across the salty ocean bottom. Perhaps the most incredible of all their adaptations, though, is the bacteria's ability to actually eat iron, and to do so quite voraciously. In fact, the little buggers are such hungry eaters that scientists have now estimated that the entire shipwreck will be mostly consumed by the year 2030. Soon after that, all that will be left of the once mighty ship, dubbed unsinkable, will be a pile of rust and some non-edible furnishings from the interior. So if you planned on seeing the Titanic with your own eyes anytime soon, you may want to get yourself into a deep-sea submersible and take a trip down now while you can, because as of today, you only have 10.5 years left to catch a sight of this sunken wonder of the world. The mighty ship the Titanic is sinking into the icy waters of the North Atlantic Ocean in the early morning of April 12, 1912. Of the 2,224 people on board, more than half of them will die. They will drown or freeze in the ocean away off the course of Newfoundland. Still on board, though, there is a hero, the second officer of the ship. He's shouting to the passengers, "Women and children first," as he ushers them into lifeboats. He is acutely aware that there are not enough boats and many people will perish that frosty morning. He was right about that, but his heart would go on. His own survival was nothing short of miraculous. His name was Charles Lightler, and this is his story. A moody German philosopher once said, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger," or something to that effect. Quite a few people that have lived in this world personify that saying, and one of them was the man we're talking about today. He was born in 1874 in the industrial north of England. Moments after he entered into this world, as the black smog from the abundant textile mills obscured the blue skies, his mother died. His father took off to the country of New Zealand when Charles was just 10, leaving the young man parentless. Extended family took care of the young lad after that. Looking around him in that mostly poor part of England, Charles didn't see many options for himself. When he was 13 years old, he witnessed most of the other kids his age leave school and get jobs in the textile industry. spinning cotton, dyeing wool, doing some kind of hard labor in those satanic mills. Charles wanted nothing more than to escape that humdrum existence, so what better than to sail the high seas? At age 13, he began a seafaring apprenticeship, which would take him to smallpox-ridden parts of South America, to uninhabited islands in the Indian Ocean, and long after his training finished, to that frosty morning when the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic. He earned his stripes, soon becoming a second mate after preventing an entire ship from going up in flames when in India. At 21, he'd already achieved a lot and was awarded his first mate's certificate. He set off to sail around Africa, which almost killed him after he contracted malaria. Having already had a couple of lives, the young man tried out some new ventures. He prospected for gold in the Yukon territories, but that didn't work out for him. He became a cowboy in Alberta, and after giving that up, he just hit the road and became a hobo. After many months, he finally made it back to England without a penny to his name. He gained his master's certificate when he was 26 and started sailing around the world again. It would be years before he heard the name RMS Titanic, but he would become a first officer on that ill-starred ship when it was in its trial period. No icebergs were hurt during those trials. Then came the historic night. Leitler's watch had ended, but he gave the order to look out for small icebergs that were in the ship's vicinity. He told the ship's quartermaster to make sure the ship's drinking water wasn't freezing. And then once he knew things were safe and sound, he retired to his warm bed. Leitler then heard the collision, which sounded like a painful grinding as the ship was forced upon the iceberg. He got out of bed and went to the deck, still dressed in his PJs. After talking with the other officers, he believed that the vibration he and they had heard was not a great cause for concern. It was merely a scratch, and so he returned to his cabin. There was a cause for concern, though. Water was flooding into the ship. One of the officers raced to Leitler's cabin and in a panicked voice said, "Sir, the water is up to the F deck in the mailroom." Leitler got dressed and headed to the deck. The ship was making a terrible noise due to all the steam coming from the safety valves. The vessel was in trouble, but at this point in time, Leitler was not aware of the extent of that trouble. He didn't know the ship was going down, like down to the bottom of the ocean. It was so noisy he couldn't communicate commands with his voice, so he used hand signals. He now realized he had to move fast. He started getting women and children onto those lifeboats. People rushed around in a state of utter shock. The women and kids got onto those boats and the men stayed behind. Some of them would die and never see their loved ones again. He ushered some people into Lifeboat 6, and one of them was named Molly Brown, aka the unsinkable Molly Brown. She would go down in history as the woman who threatened to throw the quartermaster out of the lifeboat if he didn't go back and look for people in the freezing water. He had at first discouraged that, fearing those in the water would grab the boat and capsize it, then everyone would die. Back on board, and Leitler was getting more people into those lifeboats and making sure the boats made it into the water. The officers remained on board, and one of them later handed Leitler a gun. He told him, "You might need this." It was total chaos. Something was happening on Lifeboat 2. Men were trying to take it over. Leitler jumped into it, and with that gun pointed at the men, he ordered them to get out. Women and children first. At around 2 a.m., all the lifeboats were in the water, but there were still plenty of people on board. There were 4 more boats, but those were collapsible canvas-sided boats. At one point, only 15 more women could be found, so Leitler finally gave the command for men to get in the boats. Then, to his surprise, an officer turned up with more women. This time, the men dutifully got out of the boat and gave their seats to those women. For most of them, it was a life for a life. Leitler was told by the first officer that he should get in one of the collapsibles. He replied, not bloody likely, he wasn't going anywhere. There was still hope though, even at the end, since Collapsible B had space for him. Water flooded the deck, and Leitler managed to get on top of the officer's quarters, ready to get into that boat. This never happened. While he was on that roof trying to cut the ropes holding that last boat, the Titanic plunged into the water. Leitler knew where he was headed. He stared hard at the rising water and just dived in. He swam with all the strength he had to get to the surface, but as bad luck would have it, he suddenly got sucked in by one of the ventilator shafts. He was stuck and going down with the ship. But then God, or whatever he believed in, shone down on him, because a boiler blew up and the force knocked Leitler away from the shaft. He was now in the water with the other men, and there was Lifeboat B, albeit overturned. Officers and crew were around that boat in their numbers. Other men swam toward it, but when the officers saw that, they ordered everyone to swim with the boat in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, not everyone could get on. The sheer weight would have sunk it. As they waited for rescue on that overturned boat, 3 men died in the bitterly cold water. Leitler wasn't one of them. He was rescued. And that's where we come to the second part of the story. In the First World War some years later, his heroics would start again, and he'd be handed medals for his actions in taking out a German Zeppelin. As the war was coming to an end, he was the captain of a destroyer, and that sunk. Again, he was in the water awaiting rescue, and it was almost 6 years to the day after the calamity of the Titanic. Not long after that, his own ship took out the German U-boat UB-110. This became a matter of controversy, since a German captain later wrote that his men ended up swimming for their lives in the ocean. Even in war, the ethical thing to do would have been to rescue those men and capture them. The German captain said Leitler gave the order to start shooting the Germans in the water. Wasn't that a war crime? Years later, Leitler commented about his actions, saying he didn't believe in all that hands-up-in-the-air business. He said after facing constant German attacks, how could anyone have the audacity to think they could just surrender? He despised those submarines, lurking under the water, not fighting one-on-one. He called them an abomination polluting the clean sea. Leitler retired shortly after the war, mainly because he found it hard to get work. Even though he successfully defended what happened on the Titanic, getting a job wasn't easy. Despite his heroics, his name would forever be tainted with the sinking of that ship. But he was by no means done with sailing or wars. At the time the Second World War started, Leitler was living a quiet life as a chicken farmer. He still loved the ocean and owned a small yacht. He named it Sundowner. In 1940, Leitler's role in the campaign that was his life would be reversed. And that's because the rescued man would become the rescuer. The Germans had surprised everyone and blitzkrieged their way through Europe, which ended up with the entire British Expeditionary Force being stranded on the French-Belgian border at the port of Dunkirk. 400,000 men were sitting like ducks in a barrel on the coast as German planes dropped bombs on them. German tanks were moving in on land, only about 10 miles away. Thankfully, those tanks didn't move that fast. The event has gone down in history, and that's because 338,000 of those men were not slaughtered as some expected. The British had a plan, and that was to use everyone possible to go get those men. That included civilian boats, and guess who owned one of them? The British got Leitler on the telephone and told him that they needed his beloved Sundowner. Leitler replied, saying, "If anyone's taking that boat, it's me." On June 1, 1940, the 66-year-old Leitler took his son and his son's friend to Dunkirk in that yacht. They arrived safely and managed to get 130 men on the yacht, despite the fact that it had never had more than 30 people on board it before. Some of those men had been pulled up from small boats as well as from the water. German planes fired at them as they sailed back to England, but they never got hit. There was some typical British humor on the trip home, even as they faced being blown out of the water. One of the soldiers discovered that Leitler, their captain now, had been an officer on the Titanic. "Bloody hell," the man said. "I should jump over right now before he sinks this thing." The men laughed, and one said if Leitler had survived that, then he could survive this. In just 12 hours, the mission was over. Leitler's two sons fought in that war. His youngest son became a Royal Air Force pilot and was killed in action early in the war. His eldest son joined the Royal Navy and was killed close to the end of the war while he was in charge of a torpedo boat. Leitler lost 2 out of his 5 kids. By the 8th of December 1952, London was suffering from severe air pollution, something that was called the Great Smog. It's thought that the smog and Leitler's fondness of his pipe led to his death from heart disease. He died aged 78. Leitler has since been depicted in many movies, with the latest depiction being the guy from the movie Dunkirk, who takes his son to rescue those stranded soldiers. You ever hear that expression, so-and-so was born to do this or that thing? Well, Violet Jessup was pretty much the opposite of that. And after surviving an incredible 3 separate ship accidents, with 2 sinking in just 5 years, one could say that she probably shouldn't have ever set foot on a boat in her life. Depending on the way you look at it, Violet either had the best or worst luck in life. Born in Argentina to Irish immigrants, Violet contracted tuberculosis as a child. This was sometime in the late 1800s when medical technology's best solution to tuberculosis was getting massaged with vinegar or huffing down a can of turpentine. Of course, this was a rather bold scientific leap forward from the Middle Ages tuberculosis treatment known as the royal touch, where sufferers would line up and wait to be touched by an English or French king or queen. Exactly how a sufferer would be touched is unknown. Was it a quick attaboy pat on the head or a sportsmanlike good game slap on the rump? Sadly, the knowledge is lost to history. Despite being given only months to live, little Violet knew deep down in her heart that she had a higher calling in life, namely to go 3 rounds with Poseidon himself, the angry lord of the sea, and beat him in each matchup. She managed to survive her tuberculosis, though sadly her father would die and the family was forced to move back to England. Violet's mother soon found work as a stewardess on Royal Mail Line ships, at a time when the British and the French were engaged in fierce competition to see who could build the fastest, most luxurious passenger liner to cross the Atlantic. Violet's original plans for her life was to attend a convent and give her life to religious service. But when her mother's health deteriorated, Violet became a stewardess to help support her ailing mother. Soon she was working for the legendary White Star Line, putting in a 17-hour day and being paid the equivalent of about 230 British pounds per month. Violet was assigned to the Olympic, which at the time was the largest passenger liner in the world. On September 20th, 1911, the Olympic was cruising near the British battlecruiser the HMS Hawk. As the Olympic made a wide turn to starboard, the width of the turn took the captain of the Hawk by surprise, and he was unable to maneuver the Hawk out of the way fast enough before the two ships collided. A sturdy cruiser, the Hawk's bow had been designed to smash into other ships and sink them by ramming into them, which resulted in large tears on the Olympic's hull and the flooding of two of her watertight compartments. Despite this, she managed to steam back to harbor for repairs under her own power. The Hawk, meanwhile, suffered so much damage that she nearly capsized on the spot and had to be towed back to a shipyard for repairs. Clearly, the Hawk, designed to sink ships by ramming them, was not particularly good at its job, which is probably why it was sunk by a German U-boat 2 years into World War I. The Germans, unlike the British, apparently preferred to sink ships by exploding them rather than trying to ram them and failing miserably. Violet likely suffered great trauma from the collision, and after seeing how horrible the Hawk had been at its job of sinking ships by ramming them, she probably had serious doubts about British ship engineering. That's likely why when the legendary Titanic, billed by the British as unsinkable, came looking for a crew, she was likely extremely skeptical of that claim and reluctant to join the crew. Nonetheless, her friends persuaded her to take the job on the Titanic, officially going down in history as the worst friends in the world. On the fourth day out, early in the morning, Violet was awakened in her bunk by the terrible sound of metal screaming and buckling under great pressure. The Titanic had encountered the fatal iceberg that would be its doom. Violet was immediately ordered up onto the deck and would later tell that the passengers were strangely calm, with the ship's officers enforcing a strict women and children first policy at gunpoint sometimes. Violet boarded a boat full of women and had a child thrust into her arms. Incredibly, the distraught mother of the child, lost in the chaos, would be reunited 8 hours later aboard the Carpathia as it took the survivors. What might be the strangest of all, though, is the fact that on the night of the sinking, just hours before, as Violet was getting ready for bed, she'd been reading from a book containing a translated Hebrew prayer. The prayer had been given to her by an old Irish woman and was rather peculiar, as it was meant to help protect the reader from fire and water. Violet read the prayer herself and then made her roommate read it as well. Whether the prayer worked or not, Poseidon's second attempt at murdering Violet Jessup had failed, but he was not done trying. 2 years later, Germany decided it was time to kick off its favorite 20th century hobby of starting and losing terribly world wars. Violet volunteered to serve aboard the HMHS Britannic, a sister ship to the Titanic, albeit with serious design changes after the latter's sinking. The Britannic had been an ocean liner like the Titanic, but at the start of the war had been pressed into British service and converted into a hospital ship. On her 6th voyage to the Middle Eastern theater in order to pick up wounded and bring them back to England, the Britannic found itself crossing the Mediterranean Sea once more. As she passed by the Greek Isle of Kea, an explosion shook the ship. Probably having an extreme case of deja vu, Violet immediately heeded the ship captain's call to prepare to abandon ship. The Britannic had accidentally wandered into a minefield laid down by German U-boats. While hospital ships were not legal wartime targets, mines sadly don't discriminate, and the Britannic had the bad luck of running straight into one. The explosion was small enough that those on the opposite end of the boat simply assumed the ship had run over a smaller ship and was not in any serious danger. The reality was that the explosion had ruptured watertight bulkheads and flooded one of the boiler rooms. Luckily for the Britannic, the sinking of the Titanic had led to the ship going back to the dry dock to have her watertight bulkheads elevated to rise all the way up to B deck. This helped keep the ship afloat for a while, but unfortunately nurses had opened up the portholes on the lower decks in order to ventilate the wards, which was against standing orders. As the ship listed to her side, the open portholes allowed the seawater to rush in, adding to the flooding all across the ship. The coast of the Greek island of Kea was close, and thus, despite an increasing starboard list, the captain of the ship turned her toward the faraway beach. His hope was to beach the massive ship, but the explosion had destroyed the steering gear, which made steering by rudder impossible, Instead, the captain ordered the port shaft be cranked up to a higher speed than the starboard shaft, helping steer the ship via variable power to the propellers. Slowly, the ship turned toward the island and even made headway to the distant beach. While it had taken over an hour for the Titanic to sink, though, the Britannic was in serious trouble just 15 minutes into her encounter with the sea mine. In a state of panic, a few crew members lowered 2 lifeboats into the water, despite not having been told to do so. The captain realized what was going on and immediately ordered the ship's engine to be stopped. Sadly, the order was given too late. The 2 lifeboats that had been lowered were sucked into the still-turning propeller and, along with the passengers, chopped to pieces. The captain ordered no more lifeboats be launched and restarted the ship's engine, hoping that it would be able to beach the massive ship. As the sinking increased, however, it became apparent that it would be impossible to reach the shore in time, and thus the captain ordered the engines cut for good and gave 2 long blasts on the ship's steam whistle, the official order to abandon ship. By then, the water had already reached the bridge, and the captain was able to simply walk off the deck and into the water, swimming to a nearby boat and coordinating the rescue from there. Of 1,065 people on board, only 30 would be lost in the accident. Sadly, most of these were from the lifeboats that were launched without permission, their passengers sucked into the massive propeller and sliced into mincemeat. Despite surviving 3 disasters at sea, Violet incredibly decided that she would continue her career on the ocean. Or perhaps by this time she was pretty convinced that there was really nothing left Poseidon could throw at her to kill her once and for all. Violet would go on to spend 42 years at sea before retiring and passing away in May 1971 at the ripe old age of 83. On April 15, 1912, tragedy struck when on its maiden voyage, British megaship Titanic hit an iceberg and soon after found herself at the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean. The manufacturers claimed it unsinkable, but more than 1,500 of the 2,224 passengers and crew aboard died that day, making it one of the deadliest commercial peacetime maritime disasters in modern history. Despite its infamy, or perhaps because of it, will there ever be a new version of this ship built? It's been rumored for years, but not materialized yet, and that's what we'll be exploring in this episode of the Infographic Show. Will there be a Titanic 2? There have been a number of rumors about the proposed plan to build the Titanic 2, and most seem to link back to an Australian business tycoon and millionaire, Clive Palmer. He originally announced the project back in 2012 with the new Titanic proposed to be on the water by 2016 as the flagship of his cruise company, Blue Star Line Party Limited, based in Brisbane, Australia. The new 9-deck ship would be 885 feet long, which is 2 feet longer than the original Titanic, and 174 feet high, with a maximum speed of 24 knots. She would have been able to carry 2,400 passengers, 177 more than the Titanic. But 2016 came and went, and no Titanic 2 has yet turned up. So why the delay? And is Clive Palmer really going to be launching the ship? Back in 2015, Australian news network ABC ran a report on Palmer, claiming that his business empire was facing financial hardship due to a drop in iron ore prices and a $2.3 billion write-down of his main asset, the Sino Iron Project in Western Australia. It looks like this could have been the catalyst for the delay in producing Palmer's dream ship, as in the same article, the boat-building project's Finnish engineering partner Delta Marine was quoted confirming that the work with Palmer's Blue Star Line had come to a halt. At the moment, we have no work ongoing, a company spokesman told ABC. Is Palmer broke? Despite experiencing cash flow issues, it's hard to get a genuine insight, as Palmer's 3 main companies had not filed any financial returns since late 2013. Historically, when companies file late or when companies have accounting irregularities, it can be a sign of deeper problems or a malaise, said Jeffrey Knapp, a lecturer in accountancy at the University of NSW's School of Business. Palmer also declined to talk to ABC about his financial situation. Will Palmer's Titanic ever materialize, or is this just a lot of news about nothing? British newspaper The Daily Telegraph also mentioned Palmer and the mystery ship in an article they ran in January this year, claiming that the project is yet to begin construction. The newspaper published pictures from 2017, released by Palmer's Blue Star Company, showing the ornate interiors, which bear a close resemblance to the original ship, with the same Turkish baths, Edwardian-style gym, and the grand staircase, which is one of the most recognizable features of the Titanic. Impressive-looking pictures, but still no ship. The newspaper's travel section attempted to contact the Blue Star Line for an update on the project, but got no response. So, no Titanic 2? Actually, if Palmer and Blue Star don't bring the ship to the water, there may still be some good news in the pipeline for Titanic fans, as it looks like the Chinese have their own project on the go. In 2014, the Qijing Energy Investment Group allowed the planned construction of a replica Titanic, and it kicked off in 2016. Known as the Roman Dicey Titanic, the ship was already half completed last December, with 6 of its 9 decks built. The ship will be identical in size to the original vessel and measure 269 meters long and 28 meters wide. But it won't be going anywhere. Instead, it will be docked on the Qi River in Sichuan, southwest China, kind of like a museum in memory of the original ship rather than a fully functioning vessel. It will cost $105 million to build and includes a ballroom, theater, swimming pool, and cabins, all in the same style as the 1920s vessel. The ship will be a central feature of the new amusement park in China called the Romandasi 7-Star International Cultural Tourism Resort, which can accommodate up to 5,000 tourists. The date is April 27, 1865, and the night is dark save for the hundreds of stars above you. You relax in your cabin aboard the steam paddle boat Sultana, hearing the steady thumping of the paddles on either side of the ship as they propel the boat along with the conversations and soft singing from almost 2,000 Union soldiers aboard. You chuckle to yourself, thinking how 50 years in the future a bunch of poor souls will be aboard an Atlantic passenger liner playing a losing game of chicken with an iceberg. You're safely aboard a paddle boat on the Mississippi River. No icebergs here. Then, suddenly, there's an explosion, followed by screaming. The entire ship shakes and shudders, and not long after there's a second and then a third explosion. Your paddle boat is sinking fast, and it's 1865, so you remember that you don't know how to swim. The Sultana stands as the U.S.'s worst maritime disaster, and one of the worst maritime disasters in the world. The sinking of this paddle boat would ultimately kill more people than even the Titanic. And yet most people today have completely forgotten about the event. Even when it happened though, the tragedy of nearly 2,000 dead was largely ignored, though that may be due to a public having grown indifferent to death after years of civil war. What can't be ignored, however, is that the deaths of 1,547 men could have all been prevented if it wasn't for some good old-fashioned government corruption and the greed of the Sultana's captain. At the end of the Civil War, both sides got around to the business of reconstruction. The North was looking forward to returning troops coming home, and the South was busy fixing its shattered economy. Both sides had released tens of thousands of enemy prisoners, and in camps near Selma, Alabama and Andersonville, Georgia, Union prisoners had been marched to a camp outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi, so they could get passage back up north on a ship. Plying that river was Captain James Cass Mason, in command of the paddle-wheeler Sultana, with a tonnage of 1,719 tons, a length of 260 feet, and a beam of 42 feet. The Sultana was a small steamliner that typically carried bales of cotton. During the war, however, she and her crew of 85 had been commissioned to carry troops instead. And when Captain Mason stopped in Vicksburg for repairs, he heard about the troops needing passage up north. The U.S. government had offered a fee for $5 of each soldier and $10 for each officer to be transported north, which was somewhere on the order of around $150 for each soldier alone in today's money. Needless to say, this was an incredible opportunity to make a great deal of money very quickly, and Captain Mason was never one to let an opportunity pass him up. Yet, a hired mechanic argued with Mason and his chief engineer over the plan to transport soldiers, highlighting that one of the Sultana's 4 boilers needed very serious and very urgent repairs. Mason shooed his engineer off, however, and ordered him to do a patch-up job. If he waited for proper repairs, then all those soldiers would find another way to get home. Steamships had in recent decades replaced sail ships all across the world, yet steam technology was notoriously dangerous. On a steamboat, the ship is powered by the heating of water until it produces, you guessed it, steam. That steam is then fed to a piston cylinder, and the incredible pressure pushes the piston up. When that piston is pushed up, it opens a valve that lets the highly pressurized steam vent out safely, and thus drops the piston, starting the entire cycle over again. Problems occur when that valve isn't fully opened and the steam isn't able to vent quickly enough. Then pressure rises rapidly until inevitably there's a steam explosion. Other times, though, a ship that takes on too much water could have very cold water come into contact with the superheated boilers and cause an explosion that way. In the Sultana's case, it appears that she suffered both fates. But before she did, the hired mechanic once more protested to Captain Mason about the necessary repairs. He was ignored and for a second time ordered to carry out a patch repair job. Something good enough to get a ship full of Yanks up home, and then the boilers could get the proper repair they needed, while Mason went swimming through piles of cash, Scrooge McDuck style. Mason quickly got in contact with the government official and offered his services. The Sultana was only rated to carry 376 passengers, and yet over 2,000 Union soldiers needed to be transported. Seeing it as an investment in his soon-to-be rich future, Captain Mason bribed the government official to let him transport as many soldiers as he could fit on the ship. And seeing no harm in overloading a boat by a factor of 6, the official happily accepted the bribe, and soon the Sultana was setting off with over 2,100 people on board. The ship was so cramped that there was barely any room for anyone to sit down, and soldiers had to lay where they could, many of them crowding the decks. The decks themselves creaked and sagged, needing to be supported with the use of heavy wooden beams. On April 24, 1865, the Sultana set off from Vicksburg carrying 1,960 former prisoners of war, 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, 70 paying cabin passengers, and 85 crew. The prisoners had just spent months or even years in Confederate prison camps, and many of them were in bad shape. Injuries and illness plagued the soldiers, and yet they were all looking forward to getting back home to loved ones. Sadly, Captain Mason's greed would make that an impossibility. On the day the Sultana set off, the Mississippi River was particularly dangerous to navigate. The river was flooding in many parts due to dammed Yankee snow from up north melting in springtime and feeding torrents of water into the river. The flooding had uprooted trees, and on that fateful day, they choked the water as far as the eye could see. Fast-moving river water only compounded the dangers, yet the Sultana was safe enough as she picked her way up north. Over the next 2 days, she made her way along the flooded Mississippi, the flooding so extensive that it spread as much as 3 to 5 miles inland, and left only the tops of tall trees visible. On April 26, she reached Helena, Arkansas, and photographer Thomas W. Banks took a famous photo showing her overcrowded decks. Around 7 p.m., the Sultana finally reached Memphis, Tennessee, and here she unloaded 120 tons of sugar from her cargo hold, along with about 200 men. These men would no doubt be counting their lucky blessings just a few hours after their debarkation, but for now the Sultana steamed upriver to take on a new load of coal. That night, just shy of 2 a.m., the Sultana was slowly steaming up north of Memphis. The boilers were being overworked, and the allowable steam pressure in each had been exceeded as the heavy ship tried to fight against the river's current. To make matters worse, the boilers were made out of a type of metal that was known to crack and become brittle when heated and cooled repeatedly. Given the nature of a steam engine, this should have probably tipped off its constructors and warned them against its use. Suddenly, one of the 4 boilers exploded. The soldiers had been packed in so tight that many were right up against the boiler room itself, and the blast instantly killed hundreds. A moment later, shrapnel from the first explosion pierced the other boilers, and 2 of them blew up as well. The massive explosion was followed by a huge release of superheated steam, literally cooking hundreds of men alive. With the force of the explosion directed upward at a 45-degree angle, the decks above were ripped apart, along with the men trying to sleep on any open spot they could find on the cold wooden floors. The pilot house was itself ripped apart, instantly killing the boat's pilot and its believed Captain Mason. The force of the explosion had killed hundreds, but some lucky few were merely pitched into the cold, dark river. This would save them from the collapsing smokestacks, with one plunging into the hole torn open by the explosion, and the other falling forward and crushing dozens of men to death as it fell on the crowded forward deck. The forward half of the upper decks collapsed from the structural damage and the weight from the smokestack, sending hundreds plummeting down into the furnace boxes. The open fireboxes quickly set fire to the ship, turning the steamship into a raging inferno in minutes. Those who survived the initial explosion, the collapsing decks, the fire, and the crushing smokestacks all panicked and tried to jump into the water to save themselves. Due to many not knowing how to swim, however, and the fact that most of the men were weakened by their time in captivity, Most drowned. Men desperately clung onto each other but succeeded only in ensuring that entire groups drowned together. Along the shore, Southerner and former Confederate soldiers rushed to boats and other steamships in a bid to try and rescue as many survivors as possible. Where just weeks ago the two sides would have been trying to kill each other, now a desperate attempt to save the drowning Union soldiers was launched. Sadly, the fast river current, the raging inferno aboard the ship, and the weakened condition of the men doomed most to death. An exact death toll is unknown, but the best estimated comes from the United States Customs Service, which listed the official death toll at 1,547. Bodies from the wreck continued to wash up months after the incident though, and Captain Mason's own body, or that of his chief engineer, were never found. Roughly 760 survivors were rushed to hospitals in and around Memphis, and in a stroke of luck, the Union had turned Memphis into a supply and recuperation city during the war. Here, the Union's wounded could be treated, and they could recuperate from their injuries, rather than being shipped all the way up north. This turned out to be a bit of good luck for the survivors, as there were plenty of medical facilities available to treat the wounded. Of those that made it to hospitals, only 31 died as a result of their injuries. Surprisingly, despite the war having ended just weeks ago, the people of Memphis showed great sympathy for the Union victims. In the wake of the Sultana's accident, conspiracy theories have abounded. Some claimed that Confederate sympathizers had sabotaged the ship in order to kill as many damned Yankees as they could, embittered by their loss in the war. Yet an investigation into the incident revealed that the cause of the disaster came down to a combination of factors, chief of which was Captain Mason's greed. Secondary was the weak metal used in the construction of her boilers, and the pre-existing damage which turned them into a ticking time bomb. In the end, though the Sultana killed more than the Titanic, she remains relatively obscure, and perhaps that's because her sinking was preceded just 2 weeks earlier and overshadowed by the assassination of President Lincoln. It's 1937 and you're just an average German who's won the opportunity of a lifetime. First-class accommodations aboard Nazi Germany's premier airship, the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg is the height of luxury, a 60-plus flight veteran of the world's first airline, DELOG, which stands for something in German that we don't feel our narrator gets paid enough to pronounce. She sports a luxury cabin for every one of her passengers, and she's also the fastest way to cross the Atlantic and get to America. Gee whiz bang, you say to yourself in Nazi, the opportunity of a lifetime. But wait, you think? Isn't hydrogen a highly flammable gas that could end in catastrophic incineration of the airship and a horrible fiery death for all of her crew and guests? Nah, you decide it's 1930 and man is a technological god by now, master and commander of all he surveys. Why, just a few years ago, some fellas came out with a color-talking picture. Hello, future. Hydrogen is nothing to worry about. Soon, though, you'll discover that hydrogen is in fact something to worry about keenly. But what led to one of the most horrific airship disasters in history? A tragedy so shocking that it brought the golden age of airships to a screeching halt. The first airship was built by Frenchman Henri Giffard in 1852 and featured a simple 3-horsepower steam engine that would in turn spin a large propeller, giving the airship a speed of 6 miles per hour. The first true Zeppelin, though, would fly late in the 1800s and would get its name from German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who pioneered the use of airships to ferry passengers. Eventually, transatlantic service to America was made possible, with the Graf Zeppelin pioneering the first of many such flights. In the 1900s, there were two options for lifting airships. The first was to use helium, which was much safer as helium is not flammable. Unfortunately, helium was not widely available, and the only large-scale industrial processes to create helium existed with the many oil refineries of the United States. This difficulty in producing helium made the gas incredibly scarce, and the United States quickly adopted legislation to ban the export of helium outside of the US. Hydrogen was much more widely available and was much easier to make. This made the gas cheaper and much more in vogue to use for airship construction. Hydrogen, however, came with the famous drawback of being extremely flammable, and all it would take for an airship to end up with disaster, as the Hindenburg would find out, was a stray spark. To prevent this, though, many measures were taken, including covering the skin of the lifting body with non-flammable material and keeping the gas separated into different compartments. Some airships, mostly American in design, featured a hydrogen core surrounded by helium. Hydrogen may have been more dangerous, but as we said, it was cheaper and it provided more lift than helium. Despite many reservations, the Germans who led the way in airship manufacturing decided that given their exemplary safety record, they'd go ahead with continuing to make hydrogen airships. Despite this though, the Hindenburg was originally meant to be lifted by helium rather than hydrogen. Designed in the 1920s, German builders hoped that as the Zeppelin neared construction, the American ban on exporting helium would be lifted. When US Congress refused to do so, the Hindenburg was quickly redesigned to be lifted by hydrogen. Because hydrogen had more lifting power than helium though, the Hindenburg could afford larger and more spacious accommodations. The ship featured luxury cabins and a grand dining room with an aluminum grand piano featuring ivory keys crafted from the tusks of murdered elephants. Because it was 1930 and smoking was good for your health, the ship even included a smoking room where you could join others and freely smoke your cigars and cigarettes. But wait, smoking inside a vehicle lifted by 7 million cubic feet of extremely explosive gas? Yes, we hear your questions already. And it turns out the citizens of the 1930s weren't completely insane, and thus the room was pressurized so that no hydrogen gas could leak in, and a busboy would carefully check each occupant for lit cigarettes, cigars, or pipes as they exited. On May 3, 1937, the Hindenburg set off on its last flight, lifting up into the air with 36 passengers and 61 crew. The ship famously made for such a smooth ride that passengers often didn't even realize they'd already lifted up into the air until they looked out a window, still believing themselves to be moored to the ground. On this trip, the Hindenburg would set off for the English Channel and then to open sea, crossing the Atlantic in half the time of the fastest steamliner, or about 4 days. Aboard the Hindenburg, the passengers settled in for the trip. The cabins may have been luxurious, but they were still small, and the ship's designers expected that passengers would spend most of their time in the public spaces, of which there were plenty. Large public rooms featuring tables and couches flanked the cabins on the upper deck, with a dining room to port and a lounge and writing room to starboard. On the lower deck were washrooms as well as areas for the crew, and of course the famous smoking room. All in all, the Hindenburg offered all the accommodations of a luxury steamliner, though passengers would have to forego the large outdoor decks of a steamship because, after much careful consideration, the Hindenburg builders decided that passengers being blown off the ship to their deaths thousands of feet below would be bad for repeat business. In lieu of exterior spaces, large slanted windows ran the length of both decks, giving an incredible view of the peasants below, stuck walking around on their dumb peasant feet while the rich elite floated serenely through the heavens. After a departure at 7:16 p.m., the Hindenburg flew over Cologne and then crossed to the Netherlands before finally turning east to the English Channel. By 2 a.m. the next day, it was already making its way past the white cliffs of southern England and making for open sea. Because the Earth is round and not flat like a bunch of misinformed people believe, the Hindenburg followed one of the several trajectories that typically arced up north. This time, the ship flew to the southern tip of Greenland and then south again, crossing into North America over Newfoundland. Unfortunately, strong headwinds delayed the ship's passage by nearly a full day, and this might have proven fatal. If the Hindenburg had arrived on time, it may perhaps avoided the atmospheric conditions that led to its ultimate doom. On noon of May 6th, the ship had reached Boston, and because Boston has very little worth looking at, it quickly made its way up to New York City, where by 3 p.m. it was floating serenely over the skyscrapers of New York City. The ship then flew south and arrived at its final destination, the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey, arriving there around 4:15 p.m. When the Hindenburg got there, however, the weather concerned the ship's captain, Max Pruss. Lakehurst's commanding officer recommended that the ship wait out the foul weather, and so Captain Pruss ordered the ship to fly over New Jersey's coast for a few hours. With improving conditions, Lakehurst sent the Hindenburg a radio call relaying temperature, pressure, visibility, and winds, signaling that conditions were suitable for landing. At 6:22, Lakehurst radioed again saying recommend landing now. The break in the storm was quickly lapsing. By 7:08, Lakehurst sent another message urging the ship to land as early as possible. Pruss was already on approach though and soon had made a pass over the field at an altitude of 600 feet so he could observe conditions on the ground. With the wind blowing in from the east, Pruss ordered the Hindenburg to conduct a wide left turn in a descending oval pattern, bringing the ship down with its nose to the wind. As the ship made its slow left turn and reversed power from its engines, hydrogen gas was vented to reduce the ship's buoyancy and help bring it down to the ground. First Officer Albert Samt, however, soon noted that the ship's tail was dipping lower than the bow and thus ordered that the hydrogen be vented from 5 cells in the bow in order to bring the bow down and keep the ship in level trim. yet the tail continued to dip low, and so Samt ordered that the water ballast totaling 2,420 pounds be dropped from the tail, and then vented an additional 5 seconds of hydrogen from the bow's gas reserves. Still though, the ship's tail remained heavy, and so Samt ordered 6 crew members forward to add their weight to the bow. As the ship continued its descent and First Officer Samt fought to keep it level, the wind suddenly shifted directions from the east to the southwest, forcing Captain Pruss to execute a risky maneuver. With worsening weather, the captain was eager to land the ship, and it was already close to the mooring mast, so the Hindenburg executed a very tight S-turn in order to change the direction of the ship's landing. Some people believe that this sharp S-turn is what ultimately sealed the Hindenburg's fate, as a bracing wire snapped from the stresses on the body of the ship and slashed open a gas cell, venting hydrogen. At last, though, the ship reached its mooring mast and the landing ropes were dropped at 7:21 p.m., with the Hindenburg 180 feet above the ground. One of the landing party, however, noticed a wave-like fluttering of the outer cover on the port side near one of the gas cells. He would later recall that it appeared to him as if gas was pushing against the cover, having escaped its holding cell. Another ground crew member at the top of the mooring mast also testified to the subsequent investigation that he saw the same covering fluttering loosely. Just 4 minutes later, disaster struck. After many investigations, most believed that an electric spark caused by atmospheric conditions and the ship's own electrical charge set fire to the escaping hydrogen. Whatever the source, at 7:25, ground crew saw flames originating from the top of the hull just forward of the vertical fin, very near the area where 2 ground crew had seen the cover fluttering. Within seconds, the tail of the aircraft was seen to collapse inwards and then spring into flames. Passengers aboard the ship heard the muffled explosion and began to see flames devour the rear of the Hindenburg, yet there was very little they could do to escape. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the massive store of hydrogen keeping it aloft. Flames then erupted from the bow, incinerating the 12 crew members stationed there and the 6 men that First Officer Samt had sent there to try to level the ship. Molten aluminum and collapsed girders began to rain down on the field below the Hindenburg, injuring some of the ground crew. As the ship began to lean backwards, crew and passengers tumbled against each other in the walls, furniture pinning them in place in some cases. In less than a minute, the Hindenburg crashed down into the field below, the flaming wreck too hot for rescuers to approach. Incredibly though, some of its passengers and crew did survive. Some had jumped for their lives from open windows. Of those jumpers, many didn't survive the fall. Crew and passengers who were watching the descent from the public rooms on A deck had the highest survival rate, with life and death decided by where one happened to be as the fire broke out and the ship tumbled out of the sky. In all, the Hindenburg had left Germany with 97 crew and passengers, and astonishingly, only 13 passengers and 20 crew died, along with 1 member of the ground crew. Airships had crashed before and often with greater fatalities. The American airship Akron had crashed out at sea, killing 73, and the British R-101 had crashed and killed 48. The public had been largely unfazed by these accidents, and airship travel remained popular. Yet though the Hindenburg had less fatalities, it did have one extraordinarily bad stroke of luck: the presence of a film crew who had been filming the ship's descent. Within days, millions of people had seen footage of the giant airship being consumed in flames and crashing to the ground. And many today remember the famous commentary by radio reporter Herbert Morrison, who exclaimed, "Oh, the humanity!" Interestingly enough, though, that commentary was not cut together with the footage of the crash until many years after. Thanks to the massive publicity of the crash, airship travel ended almost overnight. Passengers no longer felt safe riding in massive balloons filled with explosive gas, even though airships generally had a rather impressive safety record. Instead, humanity ditched the single most elegant form of travel ever invented for the airplane, and nothing bad ever happened in the sky again. How would you have tried to survive the Hindenburg's crash? Would you ever travel on an airship? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.